Good morning, everyone. I will call the Joint Appropriations Committee to order. Will you please call the roll?
Representative Kinner. Here. Representative Larson. Here. Representative Olson. Here. Representative Schwartz. Here. Representative Summers. Here. Representative Walters. Here. Senator Agar. Present. Senator Garou. Here. Senator Hicks. Here. Senator Kinski. Here. Co-Chairman Nicholas. Here. Chairman Bebout.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you, and welcome, everybody. And I was talking to the co-chairman Nicholas a little bit ago. I thought we were the first meeting in the refurbished Capitol to occur, but I understand Management Council snuck in on us a couple days ago. We'll forgive them for that since we appropriate their money as well. But they were down the hall, so this is official in room 302, and the mural behind us is just incredible, and I know you're all very familiar with it. And we're live around the state of Wyoming, and so this is where it begins, right here with the Joint Appropriations Committee as we look forward to a budget for the two-year cycle. There's a lot of work ahead of us. You have a very seasoned committee here ready to go hit the road running. And with that, Mr. Co-Chairman, do you have any comments you'd like to make? Turn your mic on. There you go.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Welcome, everybody. I just want you to know that this is a new room for JAC, and if you can hear it, this has more echoes, and it's a more difficult room to hear folks, and particularly if there's background noise. So you just got to be careful with the background noise. We'll just have to work our way through it, but it's definitely a little bit different acoustics than we had before. Governor, welcome. It's so nice to have you in front of us. We promise to be nice to you today, but welcome everybody, and it's a pleasure to serve with all of you. And let's get the show on the road.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And I would remind everybody, nothing new to anybody that will be here, but when you testify, be sure and recognize the chair. And, we're going to have civility. We're conducted in a manner, the decorum that we can all be very proud of. And Governor, it's so good to have you here. This is your first official two-year budget, so we're looking forward to working with you. And the co-chair, we didn't talk about that, Bob and I, but do we give him a one-day hiatus or just one day? But anyway, Governor, totally up to you on how you want to present the budget, what you want to do. We're sitting here, and we'd like to have you go through it. Probably the best thing, members of the committee, would be to let the governor have his remarks at whatever level and how long he wants to do. Then we'll open it up for questions. Does that work for everybody? No problem. Governor, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Co-Chair, members of the committee. It is truly an honor to be here. And your comments about the echoes in this room remind me of the echoes in this building and the great state that we live in and the great opportunities and future that we have. Thank you for this opportunity to present my budget. I first want to thank you for all your hard work and dedication to the citizens of Wyoming. I want to also commend my budget division and the agencies and the agency heads and their staff who delivered this budget early, which I hope gave you all more time to look at it. I think it was appropriate to do, and I feel like this is the right step forward. I'm here to present my 2021-22 budget proposal, and in it you will hear me discuss both structural, which is the ongoing, and non-structural one-time funding. I started thinking about this budget early last year, and perhaps even 3 or 4 years ago. If you remember, I have had the opportunity to address you as treasurer, and it was disturbing to see some of the trends that we were starting to see in the energy sector. So I used on the cover of our budget message a photo of a train pushing through a storm. And I spoke about the blizzard of '49. Those of you who grew up with people who remember that blizzard remembered how difficult it was. But it was a short period of time, and we made it through. It was actually the blizzard of '56 that was the most record snowfalls, and we hardly remember that. This budget is presented with the intention to prepare our state to meet the storm that we see nationwide and perhaps worldwide head on. You are aware that most of the last century minerals, and in fact, ever since our state's founding, minerals have been drivers of Wyoming's economy. We have gone through periods of incredible busts in the 20s, not necessarily the 30s, and in the 50s, and again in the 90s and in the 80s. All along the way, minerals have been the drivers of our economy. These industries have provided steady employment, as well as funding for our schools themselves, and government services and communities services. Over the last decade, we have seen coal production decline by 35%. It's still above where it used to be. Natural gas prices are incredibly low, and companies are halting drilling. And while I believe oil's future is promising, and just the other day we saw a bump in prices, I believe the industry is still facing headwinds. We have to be competitive with our neighbors and with industry kind of nationwide and worldwide. So far, though, I'm happy to say I don't believe that we are facing cliffs. This gives us time to think about how we address a future where I believe there are going to be some fundamental changes. We cannot stand on the sidelines and await the next boom to save us. As your treasurer over the last several years, I took a lot of time and energy with your help to try to help prepare us for the challenges that come with better investment opportunities and better investment management, which I believe our treasurer currently is working on as well. As I look to the future, we need to take a close look at the services citizens expect and demand. When cuts are called for, they need to be programmatic and not across the board. It is important to recognize that not all cuts have the same impact. So part of what this budget does is to set us up to have a better understanding of how we can reduce our budget going forward should the need arise. I want to do this carefully and thoughtfully because, as you know well now, that many of these programs require some matching from federal government. And so if we were to cut some of these programs, we would actually have an undue challenge for the budget going forward. But to prepare for the future, the budget I propose keeps ongoing spending low, calls for a significant reduction in capital construction, employs a new approach to one-time spending, and limits the use of our rainy day funds solely for legislatively mandated educational needs and local communities. Navigating through these challenging fiscal times will require sacrifice, care, and thought. Citizens should understand our circumstances, and that is why I have made transparency an emphasis of my administration and launched the Power Wyoming planning effort. With knowledge comes the opportunity to make well-reasoned choices about our future. So, to talk a little bit just on the very highest level about the budget, about the profile, the budget reserve account and general fund projected revenues for 21 and 22 are $3.2 billion. That allows us to cover all standard budget requests totaling $2.7 billion. This leaves $23.5 million in structural funding for distribution to any entity. We funded $12 million in structural requests. Agencies will receive $174.9 million in non-structural funding, and this is mostly technology. And we'll talk about that, I hope, this morning, because as you can well imagine, technology is becoming incredibly important when we talk about just our own security, about our ability to do a job better, and our ability to do a job for less money. I've asked that the LISRA provide $105 million for local governments, in line with what we've done in the past, and $161 million for school foundation program. So, in sum, This budget is, luckily with the Craig, and as I mentioned in the beginning of the conversation that we had here today, our Craig demonstrates that we don't have a precipitous drop, in income planned over the next few years, but we do have a glide path. It is also clear that the January Craig may demonstrate that we are a little bit over-optimistic on the October Craig. That could be problematic, so we've tried to keep a buffer. But this budget is really intended to try to think about how we reshape government to be more efficient and more effective as we go forward. So with that, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, members of the committee, I am happy to, I think, probably answer questions that you might have and walk through this budget as you see fit.
Yeah, thank you, Governor. Members of the committee, what we'll do is we'll just see if anyone has any questions. I have a few, but I'll yield to the committee to get started. So any questions of the committee for the governor?
Mr. Chair, if I might,
Go ahead.
I forgot to mention I have with me here from my office Erica Legursky, Buck McVeigh, who is my Chief of Staff, Deputy Chief of Staff, Betsy Anderson, Rennie McKay, Policy Advisor, and Michael Perlman.
And welcome to all of you as well. Any questions?
Well, good.
Well, we can just, let's bring in the Secretary of State and we'll get moving. Well, I've got a few, Governor. A couple things that you've come out with, I think, is spot on when you talk about wanting to have a budget that takes care of the needs, but yet recognize that spending is still probably not at the level we'd like to see it. And when I look at the spending, and you talked about the revenues generated of the $3.2 billion, and you know, history has a way of repeating itself. And when I went back and looked at previous budgets, what I see is, you know, the previous, I think we had revenues a couple of years ago of $3 million, and then of course where you look at the actual money we spent. And the concern I have is if we start with a 3.2, just the government growth. And I think what you're telling us in your opening comments is you'd like to see that slow down as we get this reshaped and move forward. So how do you, and it'll be like a supplemental budget. Typically what'll happen, you know, we'll work hard, all of us, we'll stay within where you are, we'll make some appropriate reductions where we see fit. But then we have the supplemental budget that should be emergencies only, but you know, it usually isn't. How do you see you being the executive branch and the governor slowing that growth that's just obvious and it just happens to us? What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To answer that, let me say that first and foremost, the message I gave to my agencies was this was to be a true biennium budget and that only emergencies would be considered in the future. There are, I think in the case of one example being community colleges, they require an annual budget by statute. But this is intended to be a true biennium budget. It is intended to slow some of the spending, and particularly in those areas that we have, I think, the opportunity to pull back, obviously, in capital construction requirements. As we go forward, as you know, the Alvarez and Marcel report identified several areas of efficiencies. We're going to continue to work on those efficiencies. I have some thoughts about where the budget division should be. I have thoughts about how the PMO office can operate, and I have thoughts about those centers of excellence. As I reviewed the centers of excellence responses that we got, it appears to me that it makes sense to look long over the course of this coming year at places where true efficiencies can be achieved, places where standalone offices, for example, on budget might make sense, and places where hybrid models can come into play. I don't think a one-size-fits-all necessarily works in all cases. And so that, I would like to work with the legislature to make sure that we address centers of excellence in a way that reduces costs on an ongoing basis going forward. I think the work that A&I has done on span of control also indicates that there are some efficiencies to be had there as well. And we'll continue to work on those, Mr. Chairman. There are a couple of things that I believe we should be aware of, and those really relate to technology. We'll get to that a bit through this process. You will hear during this budget presentation that the state needs to upgrade a lot of its technology. In the past, most of that has been capital, a capital expense. So it's a purchase, and then it gradually depreciates, and you do another purchase. Much of technology at this point now is a subscription. And so it becomes an expense, not a capital expense, but just an expense item that's ongoing. And I believe that there will be inflationary pressures on some of those. So when we talk, for instance, about the RIS system in the Department of Transportation that is so incredibly important for so many of our agencies, I believe that will come with a cost that will expand over time. And so I think as we think about this budget, we need to be sure that we understand what inflation will do to it on an ongoing basis and try to make appropriate reductions where we can elsewhere.
Well, Governor, and certainly, your comment about programmatic cuts versus across the board, I think all of us would agree with that. It's difficult to find those programs that you look at the level of service, they're already in place, they have a constituency, they have their people that really believe in that. That's very difficult. And this committee, me particularly, I'm looking at that. That's one that's a tough one for us to do. On the technology side, history has a way of repeating itself. I hope it doesn't move forward in that. We've had some successes with what we've done in terms of technology. We've had a lot of failures. I know there's some big dollar amounts out there, and my inclination is to look at it very carefully and see what we think we ought to do, but boy, I'm very cautious about that, and that's something that can just blow up in our face, and I'm sure you would agree with that. One of the other things, too, when you look at LISR, and I just want to get your thoughts on it, because you now have specifically said the money for there will be for education and cities, towns, and counties, and what I worry about is the perception, and pretty soon that's going to be automatic, that LISR now is going to be the funding device for those two areas. Not that I don't agree that they shouldn't be funded at the levels, we may agree on the levels, we may not, but I think when you move in that direction, that may be their perception. What's your thought on that?
Mr. Chairman, I tend to agree with you. I think that the challenge we have is that there are, particularly in education, some required expenditures, and the LISRA seems to be the right receptacle for those currently. If the budget changes at all in terms of how we fund education, maybe there's an opportunity there to look at a different model. But I do believe the Legislative Stabilization Reserve Account, which was set up for those emergencies, is the appropriate vehicle in this interim. But I don't think it should be an ongoing vehicle, and I think we do have to look at how we restructure budget so that the rainy day account exists for rainy days, not necessarily as a way to fund ongoing programs.
Well, so, Governor, and that's how we've sold LISR, is that it's a savings account for the state of Wyoming, and I guess that's what you're saying.
Right.
However, in this particular budget, you've done this, but that's not how you generally feel. I think I would agree with that. I think we run a risk of pretty soon it's just automatic and it's their money, and down the road that's something that people have a tendency to do. On the Wyoming sense, I really like what you're doing about transparency. I think that's really important, and the more we can do for the people of Wyoming to make our budget transparent, to see where the money comes in, where the money goes out. And, we still have a lot of accounts. We still have money coming from different directions and all of that. And so we'll work together on that. Senator Hicks has worked on it. Representative Nicholas has worked on it. There's a lot of, and maybe we'll have something there that as we move forward, it'll be more transparent for what you're trying to do. I think that's something we ought to do. And on the efficiency, the lights turn off for the Senate.
Well,
now they're back on. I was going to say that's a signal, Governor. Do you have a button down there that I'm supposed to shut up?
You have the electricity, I have the lights, so, yeah.
On the efficiency, and I think the number out there was $85 million that we had talked about, span of control, all the different things we can do. And thank you so much. You and your staff are working diligently on that. you know, that's not really, that doesn't show up in terms of money we may see. How do you see that coming in during this cycle? Some of it possibly, 85 million is a pretty heavy lift.
Right.
What, is that a number you feel comfortable with as we move forward, and it'd be something that would be available to us down the road? Is that what you're thinking is?
Mr. Chairman, yes, we have worked heavily with the Budget Division, and we believe these are achievable numbers that we can come to. Part of that, as you'll note, is in the way we fund things like Medicaid expansion for schools and other aspects of that we believe we can get accomplished.
Okay. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about is how we leverage money in federal funds, and sometimes that's a good idea, and sometimes it's not a good idea. And your comments about being careful how we move forward really makes a lot of sense to me. And as we look at, you know, the thing that got us to the table has always been minerals. And whether you're pro-mineral or you don't like minerals, bottom line is they provide the funds to run the state, and they're obviously under attack right now. Coal is down. I think natural gas, I read the other day somewhere we're down 75% in our production from where it used to be 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. That's huge.
Right.
And it's probably not going to change, Governor, right now with what's going on with, we have a lot of trouble in Wyoming because of access of federal lands issues and all of that, and people are spending the money other places. And Wyoming is the highest tax state in the country in how we tax oil and gas. What are your thoughts? You know, and we can do things with coal and we can match money, and I know there's one with the SCR, but as our governor and our leader of the state, how can we let people really know that Wyoming's open for business rather than just say, please come? It just doesn't work anymore. And there's such a demand on these companies to place their money in other places where they can see a return. It's difficult in Wyoming. How can you, with us, work together to provide leadership so those companies want to come or stay here and not take their money elsewhere?
So Mr. Chairman, you have a couple of thoughts in that question, and one is on the federal match programs, and I agree with you that when we have federal match, it's not always a good idea to just sort of say this is free money. And there's a couple of examples that I can come up with in the military budget where we have new buildings that we're struggling to find ways to have custodial and maintenance expenses to those. So those are some of the cuts that I have recommended. There are other places where clearly the federal dollars help leverage state dollars to provide services to Wyoming citizens. And part of the reason we did Power Wyoming was, quite frankly, to demonstrate where cuts could, when they're taken, what they would translate into, so that people have a good understanding of what exactly they're giving up. And the reason I say this is that having been here for a while, I can remember 2 studies on taxation. One that said that people in Wyoming would be happy to pay more taxes to fund education. And the second one, which went a little bit deeper, that said, so which tax is it that you want to pay, property tax or sales tax? At which point most people said, I wasn't thinking about either of those taxes. I was thinking about the mineral industry. And so part of Power Wyoming is about saying, what is the burden? And are there ways that we can reduce those burdens? For example, does it make sense to reduce a severance tax on, let's say, natural gas to make it more competitive? Would that boost our energy? So that's part of what Power Wyoming is intended to do, and that addresses the issue about are we open for business. Just yesterday, an editorial was sent to me from earlier this year about why Utah is the #1 business state in the country, has been for several years. It is about low taxes, it is about consistency and approach, and it is about an open process for doing government services. And those are all things that are very central to this budget proposal. I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, that Wyoming should be open for business. There are 2 challenges, I think, that face our mineral industry, and by that I mean coal, natural gas, and oil. The 2 biggest challenges there are, number 1, what regulations are impeding them? And number two, do we have a competitive way to get to market? And so we're going to work very hard to make sure that our takeaway capacity is improved and our ability to bring business here and have them allocate capital to Wyoming is also improved.
Yeah, and Governor, there's an old saying, as government grows, business slows. And that's so appropriate. And having lived in Wyoming most of my life and been a businessman all of that time, I get that. And to me, when we look at where we are as we approach this 2-year budget cycle, I think things are tough right now for the state of Wyoming, no question about it. And I think your attitude is the same as mine, is that the cup is half full. And what we can do now to lay that groundwork as we move forward, things like to promote minerals, diversification, all those kind of things is what we need to do. And I look at your budget and I see areas in there that we're working on that's trying to do that, promote trade over in the Pacific Rim, do those kinds of things. So I think that's really appropriate. When I look at it though, and I look at the grants and the 600 series and the 900 series, and that to me is an area where, and one of the things you've done, we've talked about, rather than putting an amount of money on the level 2 payments that we do of $300,000, the engineers bid $299, $299.5, and to lump them together. And so I think there's some things we can do in these grants programs that, rather than just saying we have $300,000 for this consultant, and then all of a sudden the bid comes in at $300,000, maybe there's a way we can do that differently. And I don't know the amount of money, Don. One of the things in the 900 series is huge. And I can remember years ago just trying to trim that, and I made no progress at it. But that's an area I think we can really save some money on the outside consultants. We've got some great people in the state of Wyoming and your staff. Have somebody go out there, tell us what we already know, or have a report that goes on the shelf is not something that I'm interested in. So I think that's an important step we can make too.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to actually suggest that part of the thought particularly on the capital construction side and the level 2 studies that said, let's do this as a lump sum and then figure out what we're going to fund after that, comes from Representative Walters. He and I talked at the last State Building Commission and said, here's maybe a way that we can make these bids truly bids as opposed to setting a target and then seeing who can come closest to that target for level 2 studies. And so one of the things that I've really tried to do, Mr. Chairman, is to take their existing structures like the State Building Commission and give it more task-oriented processes. And I really want to thank Representative Walters for stepping forward in that effort so that we actually can take the existing structures, the existing staff, and just make the process more efficient and more competitive.
Well, thank you, Representative Walters. No, I think that's really important. And you look at the other 900 series as well in the different departments, particularly the Department of Health. That's a big number and things we can do in that area too. The other thing on the coal side, and there are those that say we should just abandon it, coal's over. I don't agree with that at all. I think it's going to be a big part of the generation of electricity in our country for years to come, only be supplanted by natural gas. And I know you're very pro in that area, so we look forward to working with you on what we can do for coal and how we can enhance that. And there's a lot of exciting things going on with the technology as well. And the University of Wyoming with our group over there is doing that. So that's all positive stuff. Anybody have any questions? Yeah, Representative Nicholas, go ahead, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I do have some few general questions that I'd like to kind of put out there, and some of the answers may come up as you present, but we're just in the big picture scenarios. Number one is what your thinking is with regards to the healthcare costs for state employees and those folks that are part of our program. It's not really addressed in your budget, and so we know that because of the way that the healthcare was basically presented and directed for the past few years, we are now kind of in a sense a healthcare fiscal cliff, So that in addition to the 10%, we're gonna have to increase another 12.5% and do that or over the next 2 or 3 years, just to break even. And so, my question is, what do we need to do to make sure that this doesn't happen again? What's your plan for paying for it? Because I know that the way that your budget is structured, you don't have the tools that we do, and so we need to work together on how to get this done. So we need to kind of cross-pollinate on those ideas so that we can work together to kind of overcome those issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman. You've pointed out an area that is of great concern, I think, to all of us. And looking at this budget as a work in progress, working with you, I am anxious to address these issues. You will note that I think over the last couple of years, and I wasn't here for those discussions, so I'm not characterizing it in any particular way, but there were a couple of holidays that were taken that have sort of brought into focus the cliff you address. Earlier this year, we looked at some of the mechanisms that the Joint Appropriation Committee had put in place to try to affect the borrowing for meeting the challenges should they arrive, and the fact that we arrived pretty much on a little bit ahead of time at the station where we needed to make some adjustments. And what I'll say is that as we looked at it, we saw that was going to be an increasing burden to the employees of the state. And importantly, the state of Wyoming is no longer the major holder of these policies. It's actually, we're what, 40-some% of the total EGI. So what we did is we recommended 12% addition to the budget. And we have the cash reserves in the auditor's office that can be used to cover those premium increases without payback, or can be used to cash flow purposes as a loan. I think we'll have to make some rate modifications to capture federal and special revenue. But I would say that they still have the $26.2 million that is available. I do believe that what we'll have to do is that we will have to have some rate increases over the next several years, as you point out, to bring us to just a break-even concept. My point has been to be steady and direct and to understand that there are substantial parts of the state that really stand to either benefit or be challenged by the decisions that we make for the state. And I think we need to be mindful of what those challenges bring.
Well, and just to comment on that briefly, Governor, there'll probably be recommendations out of this body that may impact benefits as well as amounts, because at the end of the day, it's going to be awful expensive to have those rate increases in addition to the automatic 10%. And so because those are going to be considered, we would like your input as we move forward over the next 4 weeks and as this budget formulates, so that we have as much input from you on those issues as possible. So I just want to make sure that you're part of that, of our process, so that we have everything that you want us to consider as we move forward on it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman. And I'm mindful of the fact that I think you all have looked at changes to the deductible and maybe the splits and co-payments. So we stand absolutely aligned to work with you.
So then,
Just a second, Mr. Co-Chair, to tag on to that too, Governor, and Representative Nichols mentioned it, but we've got to look at the deductibles. You got to look at what the private sector is paying and the world I live in out there, and there's a big difference, and we just have to look at it. So Representative Nichols is right. Let's work together and see what we feel like as a committee, how we think we might want to go, but get your input. I think that's the way we have to move forward together on. Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chair.
thank you. And just a few other issues that I kind of just want to, more in terms of generalities. We've talked about programming cuts, efficiencies, on just working with less capital and moving forward. And So what's important for us, though, on the legislative side, is obviously we're only here for 2 months, and in order for us to understand what you're doing and also to facilitate and to help you accomplish those things, it's kind of, we're short order chefs. You got to give it to us, help us think about it so we can kick something out for you, and over, after February. And if we need to direct certain interim studies or specific agents or committees to address or target those areas that we think are ripe or most likely to effectuate those efficiencies as you perceive them or as we perceive them as we move forward. We've got 2 or 3, basically 2 months to sit down with you face to face and say, okay, here's this one, this one, this one, and actually do this together so that when we walk away, we don't come back 10 months from now and say, look what the executive branch did and we don't like it. It just has to be a teamwork process, and so however we can help you over the next 2 months, and whatever entities you need to help you do that, let's spend the extra time and the extra hours doing that, so it's a team effort as we move this forward. Because we all know what the issue is, but the next step is the hard one, and so I think we've got to jump off of this step down this together, and kind of carry each other's water at the same time, so that we can move forward in an efficient and as fashion as we can. And we're all here to help. But we don't necessarily know how to do it, so we need your help on showing us the way. So.
Thank you for that, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman. You are absolutely correct. This is an effort we need to work on together. And I do have some ideas on efforts that might make sense for review over the interim. One of them is to think about this project management office that's in the budget, in the governor's office. And in my view, perhaps the budget division should be part of that process. Maybe you want to have a standalone budget office with PMO provisions in it, whether it's in the governor's office or whether it's in the and as an agency. That's something I would love to look at over the course of the year. It is something that Betsy has researched. There are numerous examples in different states, and I think there are benefits and detractions from each of the models, and as you and I have talked, I think there's maybe opportunities to look at that. Another opportunity that I think exists for local governments that you may want to consider. A couple of years ago, I brought up the notion of whether we could create a WyoStar 3 account in the Treasurer's office, which would have the ability to have stocks as well as fixed income investments. At the time, the Attorney General's view was that that was absolutely correct under the provision of the Amendment A process that we passed a couple of years ago. Perhaps that's something you want to look at. And then I think as we look at just agencies and health department, as you know, we conducted a study this year. I think the results were a beginning, but I think as we look at health and how we deliver health to people in Wyoming, that's obviously an ongoing conversation.
So Mr. Co-Chair, thanks. I noticed in your budget, you did some interesting things, and one of them that I noticed is that you for this next biennium, you have considerable amount of dollars on capital construction, and I presume, and so I just want to clarify this, that the purpose that you did that was recognizing, or at least one of the reasons is recognizing that revenues will be short henceforth, beginning in 23, 24. So it's kind of a now or never. And because they're one-time dollars, and because these things need to be brought up to maximize the efficiencies of our dollars, to take care, to maximize matching funds, those type of things. So for the community colleges, for University of Wyoming, and for some energy project developments, there's some sizable recommendations. So I just, as a general, I want to make sure that we understand what your thought process was there. Because, I mean, as you know, those issues, because of short dollars, it's a tug of war on where to put them. And should we put it in Elizabeth? Should we put it in the permanent funds? Should we invest in one-time dollars for one-time expenditures? And so if you could just kind of give us a little bit of your rationale on that so that we can make sure once again, we know we're working together.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, as I alluded to before, we've tried to revamp the State Building Commission so that rather than just receiving reports and recommendations, we actually have a process that evaluates across the four ex officio legislators and the 5 electeds that are in, that we have a process that allows for us to render judgments on each of those buildings that comes forward. And so this year, what we did is we listened to all the testimony that came into the SBC. I then asked each of the members to rank the importance of these proposals. As you know, they run from corrections to community colleges to the University of Wyoming to military department. And as we listened to the testimony and asked the questions, I wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity for people to weigh in. So we looked at the projects we thought were most important. And as I've mentioned earlier today, when we come to the planning process, the level 2 studies and other things, those typically were passed with an amount associated with it. I think our discussion in the SBC was, let's just pass a lump sum and allow for a true RFP and price discovery in what those RFPs would yield. So what you will have is a recommendation from this office for a lump sum on level 2s, and then there are a number of studies that came through the SBC that were ranked, and we'll make sure we get the ranking to you. But the process was to try to figure out if there were efficiencies we could get there. I have made some determinations, which I think we'll probably get to. I do believe, for example, at the University of Wyoming, the Corbett Pool is in need of refurbishment. I understand why it would be a valuable thing to have the West Side stand associated with that, but in my mind, we didn't have the money to do that. So there may be a way that we can craft a proposal that allows the university to continue to fundraise for the West Side stand. But in my view, the pool at the university was my primary motivation there. What I tried to do in other capital construction was to take advantage, for instance, community colleges, the authorization of private funding, and their own funding to be able to make sure that they met their needs going forward.
Mr. Co-Chair, on the level 1, level 2 process, in reviewing those statutes, and so I'm posing this question to your office, it may be that we need to modify those statutes to some degree, because even if we say it's just one set amount, there's still a telegraph of the total amount, and at some point, the construction management will have to set a kind of a cap on what they're willing to do for each one, and people know what the process are. And so, to me, it's probably more complicated than just making a set amount. And frankly, we should have a system that if they come in too high, we just reject and rebid. But I mean, I think, once again, if you need legislative input, and if your office studies that and say, okay, this is a better way to do it, then we welcome your input between now and session, and we have to address that. We all have that concern on kind of multiple levels. And it's an argument between transparency and vulnerability and manipulation, and we just have to find the right path. In your comments, Mr. Co-Chair, you talked about your wanting the budget to be transparent and a little bit of confusion about how we have tips and these funds that prior to, tipping into the LSRA or to wherever, that just that process seems complicated and therefore less transparent. We, on the other end, I think in general, on the legislative side, look at it in a much more simple fashion. You have your immediate checking account, you have your medium-term checking account, and your long-term savings account. And so even though they look complicated when you've got them on a diagram on a page, the general concepts are useful, and they help us save money, number one, and number two, they help us have intermediate funds so that when we do have a crash, say, during, when we're not in session, there are monies available to you and to the government to continue our operations. And so perhaps we have a little bit different understanding and an idea of the value of those tips and how they work. So what I would like to know, and obviously there's no answer today because we're on short notice, but what your recommendations are, what you'd like to see, if we can see specifics on that, and just have you take into consideration why they're there, but also to make the process more transparent and understandable of how we diagram it, how we talk about it, and how it works. We can clearly do a better job than we do now, and the JAC is in the process of rewriting the data book and trying to do that, and that'll be over the next interim as well, but that's exactly what we're trying to do, is follow up on and make it more transparent and understandable of how that process works. So, any comments on that?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, thank you for that. I do appreciate the value of how the process has evolved over time and the tips that are associated with that. My concern has been, in my time as treasurer and now potentially as governor, we continually modify how those processes work and whether the amounts are bigger or smaller, whether that a portion of it goes to another account for a specific purpose or something else like that. And so my plea really was to try to go back to the original intent, for instance, on the spending policy reserve accounts, to make sure that they still met the purpose for which they were originally designed, which was to provide a steady stream of income during downturns in market cycles, just so that we actually appreciated that's the purpose that they were put there for, and not as a way to figure out how to fund different types of projects. And I'm happy to work with you, and I'm not making any I'm not trying to cast any doubt on how the process was designed or anything else. I'm just saying when we have shrinking revenues potentially, having a clearer understanding of exactly where our revenues are and where they're going is really important to me. I think that over the next couple of years, we have the opportunity to really put this budget forward, thinking about the needs of the state going forward, as opposed to, and I don't mean to sort of imply that we've not done that, but as opposed to reacting to reductions in budget and commitments that we have to finish. So part of what I've tried to do with reducing the capital expenditures going forward is to give us breathing room to really catch our budget up so that we can do what you did with this capital, which was to set aside monies for future capital construction.
And just a couple other comments, Mr. Co-Chair, before we go on. And one has to do with the Capitol complex and how this building moves forward. I think we need a little more work on that to make sure that we're working as a team and that we move forward in preserving everything that we've done and the upgrades of 26th Street and 24th, the parking lot next door, all those things, and this whole complex. And so we'll be working with you on that in the next couple of months. The good co-chair and I have had the opportunity to go to the Pacific Rim, and the prior governor did, and we hope that you will continue that work and efforts because I think it's in our long-term best interest to do so. And as the world gets smaller and smaller, it's more and more important that we become part of those things. So I appreciate your time and efforts, and that's all the questions I have at the moment.
Yeah, and just before we get, I have a couple things too, Governor, that I wanted to visit a little bit about it. And Senator Enzi invited me to come back and testify in front of his budget committee about how Wyoming does our budgeting process compared to how our government, federal government does it. And I don't have to get into all that, we all know that. And one of the things that was pretty amazing is a senator from Louisiana, I believe Senator Kennedy, said, well, I understand where you spend what your revenues are, and I understand how you start with how much money you have rather than say, here's a program, now where do we find the money? We can't print the money in Wyoming, we have to balance the budget. I said, and then he said, well, how do you handle debt? And I said, Senator, we have no debt. And it just resonated in the room, and so your comments about, like what we did with the Capitol, you know, we started that 10 years before we ever got to the point of even beginning the construction, to have the money in place to pay for it as we go. And one of the things when you look at your budget that gives us some breathing room on the one-time money is we've realized some long-term capital gains. And that's a big part of where this money came from. You don't really see it, but it's in there, and you and I understand that. And of course, I'm a big proponent of saying we do not even think about unrealized capital gains. The market's so volatile. What is your opinion on realizing or looking at unrealized capital gains? Say, oh, all we got to do is sell some stock, we have some money, let's spend it. What's your thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, I think I feel very strongly that trying to drive a way to fund ongoing operations by trying to market time or trying to sell capital gains is a fool's errand. One of the challenges, I think, when you start to push, we are long-term investors. That is exactly what has set us up for the future with $21 billion worth of investments that have been designed to do things like do a better job funding education, try to figure out ways to meet inflationary pressures, have a better process in place. If we start trying to realize unrealized gains just for the benefit of this year's spending or something else, you have to understand, as you know, that once you have sold, and I'm trying to think of what I was, as treasurer, I always talked about this way. Capital gains are part of the property that the state holds. It's a valuation change. And so when you sell something for a capital gain, and then you have a market correction, you have lost that forever. And in my view, we have a very long-term process. We have put in place excellent and skilled stewardship of our assets, and it'll provide long-term income going forward. If we start trying to jimmy with that, we will most likely bring a lot of destruction to that portfolio.
Well, and when you look at that, and the budget cycle is more than 2 years out or 4 years out, it's really even further than that. And Senator Hicks has done a lot of work on that. He may have a question relative to, if you look at our school, a common school account to try to inflation-proof it, 6 years out, it's in trouble and some of those kind of things. So I think it's really important. We all understand education really drives the budget. I mean, you look at our general fund, we're in pretty good shape. Education is the one that has the huge amounts of money, the huge deficit. And it's just hard, you know, when you have these things going on in the education budget where you look at state employees that haven't had raises. I see where you got some money in there one time, but they haven't had raises yet. We have in the education system, in the model, that happens, you know, it happens every year and it grows and grows and grows. So that's an issue we have to deal with. Senator Hicks, you have a question, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and it just takes off from where you just left off, but in your budget, Governor, you elected to go ahead and capture what would normally flow into the LSRA and use that for expenditures in this budget relative to intercepting that 1% statutory component, which was about $190 million that would have come out of the PMPF. So that 1%'s out there, that money's gonna be available. What was your thoughts on the way you crafted that to capture those funds that would revert or flow into the LSRA versus the 1%? Now that 1%, I'm assuming, or maybe I don't want to assume, I just want to, what's your thoughts on where that money should flow now?
Mr. Co-Chair, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, you raise a very interesting point. And in my time in the previous office, it was always interesting to me to talk about what that 1% severance tax was meant to do. It strikes me somewhere around 2006, maybe you and Senator Schiffer and others talked about this needs to go, because we're doing so well on our mineral income, this really needs to go to augment our permanent mineral trust fund. So the legislature decided to put that money towards augmenting the permanent mineral trust fund. I think I prepared a memorandum a while later that asked really whether that was meant to be inflation proofing or whether that was part of corpus augmentation going forward. And in that process, we came to the conclusion that the state had not done as good a job with inflation proofing over those years as we had all thought. So where it sits now is that it sits entirely within the purview, I think, of the legislature as to how that 1% is to be used. But I am not, as governor, able to look at the profile on that or to profile at that as part of our ongoing operations. So looking at where the money for tipping over into the LISRA went from, we tried to make sure that we provided for ongoing structural issues in a way that didn't impede or anticipate that 1%.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
And Governor, you talked about it in your introductory remarks about the challenges of the future. And we all know that we've swapped very steady income streams from coal to a very volatile oil market right now. And I think it behooves us to be prudent on how we do that. And we had the discussion about the health insurance for state employees. Mm-hmm. You know, when we look at the actuarial tables for the big pool for the state employees' retirement, we're going backwards. And so the big challenge that I look at, that 500-pound gorilla out there to fund government, really revolves around health insurance for state employees, retirement accounts that we know in both of those cases are not in good shape. And yet, we know also that the cost of government is 80% employees, and you have to have good employees to run government. So knowing where we have this volatile stream and that actuarially we're not in good shape with our retirement account, we have this looming hole with health insurance for state employees, just your vision on overall government, because that's the driver of government. Where is your vision and how we're going to conquer
Sure.
that animal?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Senator Hicks, for that. Kind of as an overarching theme, this budget tries to set us up to find places where technology can be helpful. It does not suggest a pay increase, but it does talk about a one-time bonus payment to recognize the good efforts of top employees. I do believe that Wyoming needs to be more competitive in its pay so that we have good people. We do have good people, so that we have motivated people to staff government services. So overarching, I think those are things that we need to work on. As you've alluded to, part of that hiring picture is our pension fund, which is actuarially still in the top third of the nation, but still has some distance to go. There's been work over the last couple of years to look at the actuary process to make sure that we are adequately addressing the way that changes. And I'm happy to go into greater detail on some of the sort of shortfalls that I feel are there with the retirement actuarial process. I think it's entirely different from the state's healthcare actuarial process. And there, I think that it is important to note that the state of Wyoming, while it may have challenges, is not going to go broke. And so the way we set up our healthcare and the way we look at our actuarials there doesn't necessarily have to fit a private model exactly. So we've tried to thread that needle carefully to talk about finding a break-even process going forward. I think the actuarials that we will do on healthcare over the next couple of years are going to be incredibly informative to how we have to address this situation for healthcare. And as I mentioned before, you know, part of the problem we have with health insurance is that we have a number of people that have tied on to the state's health care plan, which is great because it lowers the cost overall, but at the same time, we now have a population beyond just Wyoming state employees to think about.
Go ahead, Representative Nicholas.
And just to follow up on that, Governor, the retirement has asked us, because we're the home committee for the retirement folks, for a rate increase for both law enforcement funds, because they're both heading in a negative direction at this point. So, I mean, obviously, we only have really two options. We either fund it with employer or employee contributions, and or we change the benefits to those individuals. So, once again, we would like your input on how to do that, and then also, one way or the other, it's going to cost money, and what your preferences are, so that it's not us telling you what to do, that we're doing it together. So that issue is going to come up, and I know that in this committee in October, even the main fund, there was some inquiries as to whether or not we should modify the benefits. And so I mean, it's coming down the road, so we just want you to have a full input on how we address those issues.
And Governor, in the same light too, as we look at these retirement funds, there's a couple of out there that I've been around for a long time and it's really important to the state of Wyoming. One is the volunteer firemen. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's funded, you know, primarily, they put money in, the volunteers do, as well as we use it from the fire insurance, the premium insurance that comes into the state, and then that money distributed to their retirement fund. And we're having trouble throughout the state of recruiting young people. And, you know, there's really no financial benefits other than the retirement. And so what I've been doing, and I think I've shared this with the rest of the committee, is looking at how we can enhance that volunteer fireman retirement fund so we can maybe recruit some more people. If we lose those volunteers, Governor, you know the answer to that. You're from Buffalo, KC, Shoshone, Riverton, and what we do and how important it is. So we're looking at a bill that would maybe take more of that money and have those put more money themselves into it, to have skin in the game, so we can maybe provide some more benefits and recruit some young people. Without volunteers, we're in trouble. And the number, I don't know, it escapes me, but it seems to me that it's 6,500 in the state, or does anybody know that number offhand? I forget. Anyway, so that's another area in retirement. Of course, we have Fireman A, which is a nemesis. You know, they continue to get a COLA, nobody else in the state does. And it's just not right, and they're going to be out of money, and they're going to come to this committee or this state and say, pay us off for the rest of it. It's just not fair, so that's another issue we're looking at. Representative Larson, I know you have a question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of issues or questions, if I may. And the first one, Senator or Governor Gordon, if I may, is going back to your comments about using the LISRA that Chairman Bebop brought out. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding kind of your thought or direction on that, because I read your language and it says that it limits the use of our rainy day fund solely for legislative mandated educational needs in local communities. But then you go on in your conversation to talk about how the LISRA was really designed to address emergencies in state government, and and I would agree with that, but I think that we have the potential of having emergencies in state government outside those two realms. We've seen it in the past where we've had to use the LISRA to support Title 25 if necessary, which was an emergency thing. So I'd just like a little more clarification. Are you saying that your administration is really focusing that those two areas are solely the use for the LISRA, or is there a little more flexibility there than what you put in your summary.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Representative Larson, this budget looks at that solely for education. That it was the intent of this budget. I understand that budgets are recommended by the governor and then worked on by the legislature. And so we were trying to be disciplined in keeping our efforts on the LISRA to those two areas and not to sort of try to drive a number of other expenditures from it.
Thank you, then, Mr. Chairman. So the other question, and I appreciate that does help clarify it, that for me. I'd like to, your recommendation on the Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust Fund for $12 million is for one-time, for projects in consideration. And you point out that we've not fully funded that corpus and that the reserve amounts have been left. I'm a little curious on your thoughts as why you direct that to current projects rather than putting that in the corpus to grow the corpus. Being on that committee, we could spend 3 times that on projects right now. There will always be projects. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on, because it's one-time money that could certainly have far more return if we put it in the corpus. Are your thoughts that these projects that are out there are irreparable if we don't address them sooner? Or so if you could just help me with that.
So, Mr. Chairman, generally speaking, what I would say about that is that, as you know, over the last couple of years, we have made some massive changes to how the state does its investments. And one of the things that happens when you make those kinds of changes is that sometimes you have unforeseen losses. And so the effort here was to make sure that we preserved the existing corpus and allow these funds to be used for the projects. And as you say, these projects run a gambit. They're all worthwhile. It's the trouble is we never have quite enough money to make all the good things that we would like to do happen. And so, again, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Representative Larson, that was my recommendation. If you saw fit to put that towards the corpus and the investments that are there, you know, I certainly, or a portion of that, I certainly wouldn't say that's a bad idea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Groove, you got a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Governor.
Good morning.
We've talked a lot about energy and talked about its importance to our budgetary future and what role it plays. I wanted to ask about, we also talk about economic diversification and talk a lot about, you know, things that we can do. You've got some things in your budget. Could you just help us here and highlight for me some of the things that you feel are the most important and how they translate into this budget moving forward?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Senator Guru, for that question. You're quite right that Wyoming has spent the last couple of years, several years, really working to diversify our economy. Typically, we talk about the three-legged stool. Maybe that's growing to be more multi-legged. But this budget is not solely focused on energy. That has been a biggest contributor to our budget, which is why I think we spend a lot of time on it. But I have looked to tourism as the largest employer and certainly a very large contributor to our economy. You will note that I didn't make many recommendations for general funds to go to that, but knowing that the industry for the last several years has said we will be willing to tax ourselves. In fact, I think the good chairman and I were at the Wyoming breakfast the other day, and Chuck Box, a member of that committee, talked about the taxes that are leveled in Las Vegas and how that hasn't discouraged tourism to the town of Las Vegas. And so, you know, it is clearly within the House to think about whether a lodging tax is an appropriate vehicle. I'm certainly not opposed to looking at a lodging tax as a way to bolster what is our arguably second biggest contributor to our economy, tourism. In agriculture, I have really looked to try to recraft the way the Business Council works. And you will hear in your presentation the way that the Business Council has looked at their efforts, which are designed really about helping to bolster local economic development boards, to provide more support, if you will, to, as opposed to dollars, to those efforts, to get them going, to be able to continue the great work we've done on the Asian rims and maybe expand that elsewhere. And then lastly, Senator, I would talk about the work that has been done by our banking division and the good blockchain task force and the legislators that have been involved in that, to try to understand exactly what the potential for blockchain-related industries could be, where Wyoming clearly is a leader, where we have the legislation you passed last year that's referred to as the Speedy Banks. We now have some of the Speedy Bank proposals coming our way. We're anxious to see how that turns into real economic diversification for the state of Wyoming. And I think the current indications are that we see a real uptick in trust funds trust offices that are moving to Wyoming, and financial services that are also considering Wyoming. So I do think that we have a pretty robust effort going forward in that respect. Thank you.
Yeah, Governor, thanks for that. And of course, when we hire people like that, they come into our state, the costs are so high. There's a study that we did, I remember at the presentation, that the only industry where it really benefits the state in terms of the tax revenues is in the mineral side. We all understand that, but yet we have to diversify and we have to move forward and look at how we broaden our revenue base. Very challenging, that's for sure. Okay, Representative Summers, you got a question?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Governor, thanks for being here, and we appreciate all the work you do. One of my pet peeves in the budget is always IT, and I think IT is a bad drug that we get hooked on, and then it has increasing fees with it all the time, 5 to 7% a year. So one thing I'm asking you, and it's not reflected in this budget, is we're going to get 2 or 3 or 4 new operating systems in different agencies. And I don't see a process by which we take a holistic look at the operating systems we put together. If we were a company instead of a state, we wouldn't have all this variation in operating systems all around all these agencies. And so my question to you is there going to be a process, and it's ongoing, right? I mean, we're going to have one operating system and we'll get other operating. So do you have a philosophy on how we get a handle on the variety of operating systems we have around the state and whether we can find any efficiencies in consolidating those operating systems?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Co-Chair, Representative Summers, you've picked a topic near and dear to my heart, and you are quite correct. I served in state government as a part of the Environmental Quality Council when the state first tried to consolidate its IT systems. The Environmental Quality Council was not a large part of it, as sort of was I think a hair in the whole process as it went forward. And so IT sort of ended up happening to it. And at this point, the state made, on the executive side, a big change towards some different operating systems over the last couple of years, and we're sort of half pregnant at this point. We are kind of, as you point out, multiple operating systems with sort of a foot in one and a foot in the other. My thought, and you will hear this from Director Knopp, is that we really need to make a decision going forward about what the best approach there is, and really be committed to that. Now, having said that, there are, I think, some very specialized pieces of software that are going to require major efforts to bring up to speed. You're aware of the RIS system, I forget exactly what it, revenue information system that sits at YDOT, and how that is built on a very old language, and it's hard to find some of the pieces to support that going forward, and it really does need to be updated. There are, I think in Health Department, there's efforts on the impact system and some other aspects of that will require some specialized effort. I asked Director Knopp when I appointed him to do two things. Number one, to go around the state, talk to agencies, talk to users, and find out really what we needed. Number two, to come up with a consistent approach that we could address over time to make sure that happened. And you will see that I asked for a $10 million commitment to that effort. There's been some confusion about whether it's 2 or not. I want to make it clear it's a $10 million request. There are two aspects to the technology platform that I think are absolutely critical. One is the decision of what we're going to use, and two is making sure that we have the support for the transition so that it stands up and works correctly. Thank you.
Do you have a follow-up? Okay. Senator Kinski, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor, I enjoyed your budget message. It's very well written. It's tight, it's brief, and so everything can't go in there. There's one thing that didn't make it in that I'm curious about, and that was one of your signature initiatives in your first year with the legislature as governor, which is Wyoming Works, which is a training program. And I note in here you say government can only create the environment necessary for businesses to grow and flourish. And as you know, as I do, we've heard it from businesses. There is a whole host of businesses that want to grow and diversify our economy, but they can't get the trained workforce. And so following up on Senator Garu's question, I appreciate the strategic shift on the Business Council, which I'm very supportive of. I'm curious, where does Wyoming Works and the community college training system fit into the larger picture of economic development on a go-forward basis?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Senator Kinski, Wyoming Works has gotten some good sort of start underway. As you remember, one of the things I always talked about is how we need to have a partnering operation so that we are actually training the workforce that is going to be employed in the state of Wyoming. And in this particular budget, we haven't really tried to augment that much just because we've been looking for the community colleges to come forward with more concrete proposals. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, the community colleges have a unique statutory obligation that they have to come annually to for their budget. And so my hope would be that we would see some further build out on this going forward.
Mr. Co-Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Co-Chair, just follow on if I may.
Yeah, just before you do, we have our Senate President here, Senator Perkins. Welcome. You're here to work on another important committee, so it's good to have you here.
Good morning.
He wanted to be sure and say hi to the governor.
I did want to say hi to the governor.
Good morning, Mr. President.
It's nice that you got your haircut just for this occasion.
As I mentioned, Mr. President, people mistake the good co-chair and me all the time. And so I didn't want to be confused.
Well, I didn't hear much about your trip. I hope you had a good trip over for Thanksgiving to see troops and like that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, co-chairman, President. Yeah, we did.
Look forward to working with you on this budget.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Senator Kinski. You have a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. People confuse me for my father all the time, and I tell Dad, say one of us should be insulted. I'm just not sure who. A follow-on, if I may, Governor. So do you have in mind the kinds of things you'd like to see the community colleges come forward in terms of further build out of the Wyoming Works program? Are there some specifics you have in mind? Evidently, you're concerned that the partnering hasn't proceeded as far as you'd like. Is that what I'm hearing?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, Senator Kinski, No, I'm not saying it hasn't developed as far as I'd like to see. It's new, and it's going to take some time to stand up. It's exciting to see that both Northern and LCCC have started talking about how important the Wyoming Works program is and how they're looking for it, and I certainly support those efforts. The budget proposals that we heard from the community colleges really included some capital construction that would further, particularly I think Central Wyoming has a proposal that would further some of the workforce opportunities that they have. All I'm saying is that I think it's still a work in progress.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other House members have any questions? Yes, Representative Schwartz, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor, it's good to see you. We've spent a lot of time discussing expenditures and how we can control expenditures because our revenues are clearly not keeping up. From my perspective, we need to look at the revenue side as well. I think I heard you reference the lodging tax as an option. Do you feel there's any other possibilities for augmenting our revenue stream?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Co-Chair, Representative Schwartz, thank you very much for that question. I think I've been fairly consistent and clear in suggesting that the people of Wyoming don't want to see additional taxes until they're confident that we've done all that we can on the expenditure side. And part of this budget is to try to bring some transparency and some understanding to the people of Wyoming so that they understand, for example, that why don't you cut X or Y, what the implications are for them. And an example of that I will mention is that we still have a gap in funding roads. And I've indicated to Director Reiner that we need to prioritize which roads we're gonna look at. Because I'm not trying to bring a lowered level of service, but I think people should understand and understand exactly what they're asking for when they ask for particular cuts. Power Wyoming, too, Representative, is really designed to look at not necessarily increasing taxes, but how we continue to provide the revenues that this state needs to move forward in a way that doesn't diminish the services that the citizens expect. It needs to be an informed conversation. Do I think I see anything on the table this session so far that I'm willing to look at beyond the lodging tax? I'm not clear. I think that it's important that we, working with this committee and with revenue, take a comprehensive look over the next couple of years at exactly what Wyoming's revenue picture is going to look like and how it ought to be formed going forward. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Senator Hicks, you got a question?
Yeah, Governor, just to change gears a little bit, wanted to visit a little bit about FNRPA and your thoughts on FNRPA. I'm looking through, and most of the stuff that was approved was under the last administration, but going forward, that's been a tremendously valuable thing for those local governments to be able to participate in that federal land use process, particularly on NEPA-related issues, but even ESA and land use planning. But when I looked at the current expenditures, the vast majority of that's going through the Attorney General's office, and quite a bit of that was for endangered species litigation, which we have the endangered species account, which is another $1.2 million. But just your thoughts on how we're going to use FNRPA and what your thoughts are on how we get those funds out to that process to those counties and conservation districts and local governments that are out there doing the day-to-day work, dealing with the federal agencies on these federal land use plans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Senator Hicks. We have funded FNRPA the same level that we did before. That's been our request. It is an incredibly valuable asset, and as you point out, it's useful in a number of different capacities, and it's been incredibly important for counties. I wish that I could have said that we should increase it. That's clearly within the purview of this committee to do. But we have a number of potentially significant actions. We've obviously had an Endangered Species Act. We are working actively at Coalport, making sure that, that our state's interests are well supplied there. And then there are a host of things that show up from time to time. I support FNRPA. I'd love to see it grow. And are there ways to get it better leveraged to the counties? I'm certainly willing to entertain notions on that.
Okay, thank you on that, Governor. Any House members have any other questions? Mr. Co-Chair, you got one? Go ahead.
Just one more. So I apologize to you folks in those rows. I can just see the sun glaring off our foreheads and noses and squinting going on. So perhaps when we go on break, the good governor's staff will call someone at A&I, because we need to do further either shades or something on this, because this is going to be an ongoing difficulty. So we'll do our best to work on it. So, and you may need those shades before we're done.
Oh, here we go, Governor, you got those glasses. The last couple of things, Governor, and Mr. Co-Chair talked about it, we're so unique in Wyoming, and I think it's a great, wonderful thing that we have. And that is we work together instead of like this that we see so much, button heads. We really try to get together, and it's really good from my perspective, and I think from at least from the Senate Appropriations Committee, I think from all of us on the JAC, to have an idea where you are on certain issues. So as we move forward, and if there's a decision that deals with the physicality of it or something like that, I think it's helpful if Buck or Eric or somebody would state where you are. Mm-hmm. So we know, in advance kind of your thoughts on that and where you are and what you do and what you feel about it. And a couple things in that vein that come to mind is there's been a lot of press lately about the ad valorem taxes and the issue where the counties are left holding the bag on bankruptcies. Some of it's oil and gas, some of it's coal. It is a very serious issue, and it's something we need to talk about. One of the things that is never there, though, you never talk about all the money the last 15, 20 years that have gone to those counties. And so what's going on now is drastic, it's huge, it's something we got to deal with, but my goodness, look at the millions of dollars that have gone in. And we talk about the ad valorem taxes, and in my opinion, there's no reason why we shouldn't try to get those on the same pay schedule as the way we handle severance taxes. It really makes sense to try to do that. I know there's a special committee between the House and the Senate to deal with it. Without putting you on a spot, Governor, do you have any thoughts on what you would like to see done in that area? It's huge, and I'd love to get that issue behind us and move on and try to, develop more resources, have more revenues, more jobs. We're bogged down trying to get that resolved. What are your thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. I agree with you. There is simply no way to provide enough thanks for what the Midland industry has done for the state of Wyoming, for education, for building our schools, all of those aspects. And we need to remember that they are good citizens. And I think as we look at ad valorem and their scheduling, this year we had a couple of examples, one particularly significant example of why, being 18 months behind schedule can be so problematic for the state of Wyoming. It's problematic for education, it's problematic for the counties, it's a huge issue. I want to commend Campbell County and our AG's office, as well as our delegation, for working as hard as they did to sort of make sure that we weren't left holding too much of a bag there. I do think that it makes sense to bring the schedule concurrent with what we do with severance taxes. I understand that's a heavy lift for the industry, and so I'm prepared with my staff and with our agencies to work with you to try to find a way to do that in a way that's sensitive to the needs of the industry.
Well, thank you for that, Governor, and of course, you know, it is a heavy lift because you can't expect them to pay it all, and then someone said, well, forgive it. You can't forgive the taxes they're due. And so obviously, I think there's gotta be a phase-in approach and a way to do it, so everybody's treated fairly. And the commitment they make to the state, we gotta treat them fairly, and I think that there's some progress we can make. The thing that drives that is I believe we passed a bill last session that says if we don't do that, then the counties will be first in the line of liens, which I've always had a problem with as a businessman, because that takes away the ability of a business to borrow money when you can't have the first secured position on your assets. Banks probably won't loan you any money, so that's kind of driving it, and I hope we can do something this session and really move in that direction. So thank you for that, and appreciate your working with us. Anybody else have any other questions? Well, Governor, it's so good to have you here. It's really a pleasure for me as a co-chair of this committee to be with you and work with you during this budget cycle and come forward with a budget that really meets the needs of the state of Wyoming. And we love this great state. We're going to do all we can. We have some difficult steps ahead of us, but like I said earlier, the cup is half full. And Mr. Co-Chair, unless anyone else has any questions, we're going to take a short recess. And then, Governor, are you going to stick around when we work through your budget, or are you going to have staff? You're going to stick around, both?
I'll stick around for some of it, I think, but Buck will be here for most of it, Mr.
By the way, you've been so busy, and Senator Perkins talked about it, your trip over to see the troops. Good for you. Thank you for that. Okay, committee, we'll take a 15-minute break at 10:15. Thank you. Okay, the JAC will come back to order. We are at that order of business, the governor's office, and going through his budget. Mr. McVeigh, are you the man? The governor's downstairs doing his duty with some military, and that's a great thing, and that's where he should be. So go ahead and let's, what I'd like to do, Buck, is go through your budget. You can have some opening comments. We all got our book. And I really believe in going through it page by page. We don't have to read every page, but the part that's important so we can do it and get a good understanding of what you're doing and where we are. Is that how you'd like to do it, Mr. Co-Chair? Does anybody else on the JAC have any other ideas on how to go through it? Does that work for everybody? And what I like to do too, Buck, is since we're working this different than when the governor gave his opening remarks, if somebody has a question, let's ask it as we work through the budget, rather than worry about it and come back to it. Fair enough?
Mr. Chairman, that's perfectly fine, you bet.
Okay, go ahead. The floor is yours, Buck.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, and members of the committee, my name is Buck McVeigh. I'm the Chief of Staff for Governor Mark Gordon. I'm here today to present to you our fiscal 21-22 biennial budget. And I originally had planned that I would walk through some of the highlights of this thing and then go backwards to that. But it's the committee's pleasure, as I've heard now, we'll just take it a page at a time. So at that, I'll start, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Co-Chairman, with the table of contents here. And I just want to preface that my discussion will be limited today to the governor's office of the portion of the budget. We have with us today Director Lynn Budd, who will focus on her division budget of Homeland Security. So I will be discussing the following divisions. Division 100, Administration, 200, Tribal Liaison, 300, Commission on Uniform Laws, 500, Coal Conversion Technologies, 600, Special Contingency, 2,400, Natural Resource Policy Account, 2,600, Endangered Species Administration, and the 2,900, the Baseline Scientific Assessment. So if you turn to page 4 on the summary table here, basically, what I would cover here, and again, this includes both the divisions that I will be talking about and Homeland Security. Basically, the governor, we're submitting a budget, including some exception changes and some governor's exception changes of $34,902,439. and recommending authorized employee level of 45 employees. In total, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, we have 21 positions in the office of the governor. So with that, I'll turn the page to page 5. New to this year's budget preparation, we've included the state of the agency, which just provides an agency overview. Not surprising to this body here, what the governor's function is to formulate and administer executive policy and exercise general supervision and control over the executive branch of state government. The second piece on here, as far as the agency background and structure, I wanted to point out for the benefit of this committee, that the governor's office previously consisted of, the budget consisted of an administrative budget and a policy budget. The governor's administrative staff included 11 full-time positions, including the governor, and these included the positions of chief staff, legal counsel, communication director, office manager, executive secretary, scheduler, boards and commissions coordinator, a constituent service coordinator, and support staff positions who assisted with the duties of the governor. The policy office portion included 9 full-time positions, including the policy director and policy analysts that cover the gamut of our state, from education, natural resources, all the way through to health and human services, energy and transparency, along with wildlife.
Buck, on that particular one where we have the AWAC position for the CEA, Chief Energy Advisor, when I looked at the budget, it looked like it was funded for 1 year. Is that correct? Give me a little background. Is the anticipation, is that something we'll see during a supplemental for the other half of the budget or the budget cycle, or are you thinking that's all you're gonna do?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, we would, as you'll see, we'd prefer to keep this ongoing with our chief budget advisor, our chief energy advisor.
So what you're saying then is there'll be requests later on for the second half of the budget for that position?
This is true. Thank you.
So why didn't you put in the budget this time? Go ahead, Eric, grab a mic. Has you got your mic on?
Mr. Chairman, Chief McVeigh, it is funded for the biennium.
I
We've
thought
asked
that,
for
okay,
Oh, it
I
is for
thought
the
that that's
biennium.
in our.
Okay.
Yeah, as we will get to in here as an
Well,
exception.
but you say it's for the biennium. When I looked at the budget, it seemed to me it was effective July 1 of 2019 through June 30th of 2020. I just want some.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, go ahead.
This position was B11, and it is currently in that fashion that you suggest. The budget request that the governor has is for the biennium for that AWAC position. So what we're doing, there's a statute that says if you B11 an AWAC position, then you need to follow up with that if you intend to cross the bienniums. That's what the governor is doing with this.
Thanks for that clarification. Representative Larson, did you?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Kevin, so what you're saying is that priority number one just gets us through that B11 position for this year, and then we've got it for the next biennium in the standard budget.
Mr. Chairman, what takes place is the B11 gets us through the remainder of this biennium. This request will start at the beginning of the next biennium and be fully funded throughout the following biennium, 21-22.
And then the obvious question is, where does the governor discretionary funding to pay for this biennium through the end of the year? He had money in his budget to do that. We don't have to backfill or anything like that.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Where did it come from?
I believe it was inside the governor's office in B11 from one place to the other.
So it was within the governor's office, it would be 11 the money to take care of that position. It didn't come from somewhere else.
That's my understanding.
Mr. Chairman, and that, I just learned this is provided through vacancy savings, so.
It's a really important position, and I fully support it. I just want to be sure I understand that B11, and I understand that statute. So, okay, thanks for the clarification.
Thank you.
Anything else on it? Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, so the idea of going through the agency background and structure, to point out the administrative staff and the policy staff, what we're planning to do in July 2020 is combine both the administrative and policy budgets together for, this is more an efficiency and a simplicity thing, and I'll talk about a little bit more as we get into this. The next piece I want to talk about are the agency challenges, risks, and priorities. Obviously, in a governor's staff, staffing is a big challenge and a priority. Since personnel does not carry over from administration to administration. She realized last legislative session we were a little bit skeletal, and it showed in some ways. But we're happy to say that we're pretty much up to speed now. We're getting there with staffing. One of the big challenges, obviously, is government salaries. Make it a challenge to try to find some qualified staff in these higher level positions. So that's one of our biggest challenges. When we look at agency successes and efficiencies, as pointed out here, the governor has issued a new sage-grouse executive order, which I understand has been well received by both conservation and energy groups as well. You turn to page 6. We're also implementing systems. Again, with the new administration, it's been a challenge for us to try to get everything from our scheduling format down to trying to track boards and commissions and doing a variety of different things. So we're using an operation, a program, if you will, called Salesforce, and we're trying to utilize this in the most efficient and productive manner to increase our overall efficiencies. It's been a challenge, but I think we're getting there.
Well, in that area too, we'll get into it more when we talk about Homeland Security, heads up for them, but FEMA, and yeah, Governor, please, come on up here. I get nervous when you're back there talking to everybody in the audience and no. Anyway, back to FEMA, that's a concern, and there's been instances, and I think, and I was talking to Senator Hicks about it, maybe the city or the town of Sundance, where money was lost because of, I don't know, formalities, government, whatever. And then I also know that the irrigation district in Fremont County, Riverton Valley Irrigation, where we had a real emergency, a flood, FEMA came in, the state did a great job and all that. Now they're questioning whether or not they're gonna pay because of a NEPA process. Don't understand it, but we gotta get into that. We can't burden these irrigation districts with a lot of expense just because of rules and regulations. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Anyway, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, if you'll turn to now page 8, as we are going to skip over the Homeland.
Just a second, we have a question. Senator Kinski, I'm gonna interrupt for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McVeigh, on page 6, top of the line, you're talking about implementing systems. You're using Salesforce.com, which is just it's a software program that's over the web. It's usually used for Salesforces. What are you using it for in the governor's office, and why did you pick something that's a horizontal platform over something that's more specialized software like some of the other departments want?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I'm going to let someone else answer that question because it is quite an ominous and multifunctional platform that I understand, but my exposure to it was very limited to just more of a spreadsheet, so.
So, go ahead, Rennie.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Identify yourself for the record, please.
Rennie McVeigh, Governor's Policy Director. So Salesforce is actually getting used now by multiple agencies, and it was primarily for a private sector to deal with customer relations and customer tracking. Similarly, we can do something equivalent where we're tracking the people that are seeking the services from our office. So we're using it right now to track constituent correspondence. We're using it for applications for the boards and commissions, and we're using it for people who are requesting an event or a scheduling time with the governor or the first lady. So again, it is kind of being used to help those customers who are seeking the services of the governor's office to track those as efficiently as we can. And we're trying to build that out so that we can gain some efficiencies in a system along those lines. It was the system that was used by the previous administration, so we're trying to learn it as well because it was what we inherited.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McKay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, continue. You said we're on page 8?
Mr. Chairman, yes, if you can go to page 8, we'll continue with state of the agency. Just talk a little bit here about the Program Management Office. As Governor Gordon indicated, this program currently resides in the governor's office in collaboration with the Budget Division. We intend for this to continue, as the governor pointed out. However, depending on the future of the Budget Office, whether it's in the governor's office or whether it's a standalone, we do believe that the proper place for this particular function is in the Budget Office that deals closely with agency budgets and their fiscal positions.
This is really something that can really work for us, I think, Buck, and you're gonna establish this uniform reporting model and to do all of the things that it says in the budget. When will we see this? Is this something that's gonna be quarterly, Governor? Is it something you're gonna, give to us at, whenever there's a change? How are you gonna report that and who to, and how will we follow that? I don't want another report that we just don't look at. That's not what I'm getting at. I think it's really positive. I just wanna know how you plan on doing all this.
Mr. Chairman, I believe this is going to be an ongoing function to be determined as to how we do implement this, working with Kevin and his staff as to how we're going to be reporting this on I don't think a lump sum report is good to anybody. I think it has to be kind of an ongoing, fluid process. Is that what?
And Mr. Chairman, just to sort of follow on with that, when Alvarez and Marcel were pushing to find a good reporting mechanism, they were recommending a particular software, Smart Sheets, where it came with a subscription cost and other aspects to that. We've been working with Budget Division to find the right type of reporting mechanism for you, and so would love to work with the committee to find out exactly what you want to see. We're working on aspects of, and I think Kevin can speak to where he's identified some of these savings and how they can be reported on our progress towards them.
And Governor, I think, I really believe it's more important what you do and how you utilize it, and for us to just understand and support it. We need to do it. And so is this not a new position, as I understand it? It's one that you have created. It's in your employees now, right?
Mr. Chairman, this is going to be, at this stage, it's being absorbed into existing staff. And the belief here, the understanding here is that we believe that the capabilities of identifying efficiencies in operations is within the agencies right now. We need to really engage with them and support them on identifying these efficiencies, and we didn't really feel it was necessary to go forth with an additional expense of either a consulting firm or ongoing software concerns to keep this going. We feel like that the budget office, working in collaboration with the agencies, is a perfect spot for this.
Was this not one of the recommendations of the Efficiency Commission, I believe, to do something like this? Was that not one of I think they had 17 of them, this was one of them, wasn't it?
Mr. Chairman, it was my understanding with the Alvarez and Marcel report that they were recommending a position, and I thought it was going to be maybe an outside position, i.e. hiring one of their staff to take this position.
So which is it going to be, internally with what you have, or are you talking about another position from them?
Mr. Chairman, it will be internal.
Okay. Well, if there's anything we can do, I think it's really important to do that. And I don't know that we need to do anything. That's clearly an executive function, so good. Anybody else have anything on that?
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Senator
If I may,
Kinski.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make sure, Buck, that I'm following. On page 8, you started talking about the Program Management Office, and then we segued into the efficiency portfolio. What I heard you say on the Program Management Office is you would like to have that moved to the Budget Office. Is that something you're going to do administratively, or does that require legislative action? And then on the efficiency portfolio, I understand you're just going to leave that. What I heard you to say is you're going to leave that in the Budget Division, so there's no action required by us on this efficiency portfolio, Governor's Grants Office. Is that correct? Recap for me where we are.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Senator Kinski, no, the Program Management Office and the efficiency effort, all one and the same, that will be in the Budget Office. It's ongoing right now.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. We'll go with the efficiency portfolio, Governor's Grants Office. This is a suggestion again from the Alvarez and Marcel report to be attracting more federal funding for the state, lost opportunity, if you will. But again, going to what Governor Gordon prefaced today, that we recognize that federal funds are still taxpayer money, and but that it will relieve some strain if we can utilize more federal money on our current state budget. One of the things that's been identified for the Governor's Grants Office is a company, a firm known as Alcade and Fay. They provide a weekly federal update of available grants to states, and the Budget Division has been sharing those with state agencies to parse out on applicable grants that they would be possibly recipient to if they were to put effort towards them. So this is a free service basically from this firm, with the understanding that we provide the effort in the grant writing to secure those funds.
Okay?
Okay, the last one in this, well, actually second to last, the Efficiency Portfolio Ideas Festival. This is the idea where the Governor's Office creates and funds an annual event where basically incentivizes state employees to come up with their ideas, initiatives for cost savings, revenue generation, and other efficiencies. And it's an avenue where actually the state employees can receive an award for coming up with a good idea. And this was tried before, back in the 90s. The state implemented the Savings Tips and Rewards program. It's called the STAR program. And we're going to work with the A&I's HRD division to see if this isn't, if the model of this wouldn't work for this continuation of this effort. The last item on here is consolidation of boards and commissions. This was provided in a letter that A&I Director Tricia Bach presented to the JAC, to this committee at the end of October. We recognize there's an opportunity for improved efficiency, just given the sheer volume of the boards and commissions that exist out there, and the limited availability of volunteers to serve on those boards. So we think that there's that we need to give some real thoughtful consideration into the review and possible elimination or consolidation of some of these boards to kind of be more streamlined in the efforts to provide these governing bodies.
Well, the governor provided a letter in that regard, and thanks for the letter, Governor. And I think at least my takeaway from that letter is that it's something we need to do, but rather than rush in it arbitrarily, in a budget session, we might look at an interim study. However, I still think there's some of those that we may take a look at. I have a couple. Maybe some other members of the JAC have some as well. And as we work through the process, they will come to light, and we'll see where they go. But obviously, we go through these appointments and can't find people, and it's just it just needs to be looked at. So that's my take on it.
Mr. Chairman, I absolutely agree. As you and I spoke, I think earlier this fall, you have exactly mentioned the concern. How do we do this in a way that we don't inadvertently cause more trouble than we hope to solve? And so I'm happy to look at any of the suggestions you have on consolidation of boards. I have to say the sheer size and volume and the requirements of filling those has been one of the most challenging aspects to being a new governor. Simply just the variety of boards that we have. So it's an effort we are very much engaged in and look forward to trying to figure out the best way to solve this for Wyoming.
And I think Governor, Don, didn't we write a letter to the Corporations Committee, the co-chair and I, because they were looking at it as well, and I know they brought it up, I don't remember their minutes, what did they do with it? Did they just, are they kind of where we are? Do they have any specific direction? What's going on?
Mr. Chairman, they did discuss it at their last meeting, but it was the last meeting of their interim. I don't think they have a bill on it, but they had, the last I saw, they anticipated continuing progress next interim.
Thank you. Okay.
All right, Mr. Chairman, if we could proceed with, on page 11, it's just a visual of our agency organization here with the 8 divisions that we have within. Statutory authority, performance measures, and then on page 12, these are our agency exception request priorities. As you will see, we have 4 exception requests. I will discuss these in details as we go through the presentation, but you can see the priority 1's the AWEC funding for the Chief Energy Advisor that we were talking about. Number 2 is the FNRPA funding, the general fund. Priority 3 is the tribal liaison full-time funding, general fund. And priority 4 is the emergency response, also general fund. The total amount of our exception requests, all general fund, is $2,169,272.
Yeah, in that regard, the legislature's made a conscious decision to always have FNRPA not be in the standard budget. And that's why it's always, but it's been an
Always an
exception budget for 20, how many years? I don't know how many years. And,
Yeah.
Mr. Co-Chair, I mean, it's always been that way, just to highlight it, the importance of it. I don't see us changing that. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, a question on the FNRPA, and I know we have some potentially large pending federal cases that would require a bunch of the AG's time. And I know in the past that the legislature has done direct appropriations to the AG's office for specific litigation and court cases to pursue. And my concern is with the FNRPA, knowing that what's potentially out there, that we're going to eat up all the FNRPA funds for litigation, and those local governments are just not going to have those funds available to participate. So I'm just curious if there was any discussion about, coming back to the AG's budget for specific line items for litigation. And that has happened in the past where the legislature specifically put money in that. But just a question on that.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to look down the row here to see if,
Mr. Chairman or Kaligerski, Chief, that did not come up, Senator Hicks, in specific conversations that we had. The conversations that we had were just strictly to fund the FNRPA budget as we had, I think it's last, 15, 20 years at that million.
Could you speak into the microphone?
That million was for the FNRPA. We did not have any other discussions about doing separate funding for the AG's office.
All right, thank you.
Well, I think what Senator Hicks is getting at, if you look at the list we have in our budget, a lot of it goes to the AG's office, and there's just, the obvious question is you have attorneys over there doing certain things for the state, yet we direct FNRPA money to that. Seems to me that might be their job anyway, and the money for FNRPA was more for the counties to deal with the federal bureaucracy. Go ahead, Governor.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and Senator Hicks. I do want to say that, our support for counties through FNRPA remains unchanged. There was a request from the counties to make it as part of the standard budget, if you will, fund the position they have that is currently funded by FNRPA over 2 biennia. And I denied that request simply because, we don't sort of want to encumber future legislatures. But our support for counties and county efforts, as I said in my testimony, remains undiminished. And it's nice to know that we can approach this committee if there are things that come up that really would require a kind of specific line item. So appreciate it.
Mr. Co-Chair, I'm just curious, who does the contracting? Because I know that they go to outside counsel often, but it may be the AG's office who's doing some of that contracting. So I'm just curious on how they follow the dollars.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I don't have an answer on that specifically. I know the counties do retain, they do retain outside counsel, but let me get back to you on that.
And also expertise as well.
That is correct. Thank you.
Yeah, and Governor, the statutes are very clear, that's your decision, and we've outlined it, we've manipulated that or changed it over the years to include certain things, but clearly it's up to you to do how you want to do it, but I think it should, I just have a problem to put more money in the AG's office when I think that should be the job they already do. And we'll leave it at that, okay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next page, on page 13, this actually starts into some of the Homeland Security exception budget requests that I guess in this particular case, we'll go ahead and skip over because Director Budd will cover this. Section 7, legislative reports. These are required legislative reports regarding the FNRPA account. We can refer back to this later if necessary. They're numerous, so we can come back to that if that's the pleasure of this committee. And with that, we could skip to page 19. First division here on this division budget request summary table, referencing specifically the Auto Tech Trade School grant or loan.
How's that going? I've talked to the gentleman involved in running it. Maybe Mr. Kocher has some update, but it seems to me like it's been the right thing to do, and it's really making progress. Is that a fair assessment? Anybody know where we are today?
Mr. Chairman, to the best of my knowledge, there were $5 million that were obligated, but haven't been used yet. Is that correct, Director Hibbert?
Go ahead, Kevin.
Excuse me, yes. The account balance is out there, and we're working on it, and we're trying to get it delivered on that process.
So, Mr. Co-Chair, Don or Kevin, what I'd like to do is send them a request for an update so we can get a written request of exactly where they're at. I know that in terms of number of students, enrollees, they should have had a graduating class, I think, by now, and just to get a full update on where they're at and the status of the loan.
So, Mr. Chairman, on the facility in Laramie, that was handled through the Business Council for that, and we can certainly get that status on that. And then the $5 million is still out there for reversions.
Yeah, so whatever it is, just so we put that on our radar, Don, you got that? Thank you.
Yeah, we'd be happy to get you a status update on that.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, and I also just learned here that the Wyoming Business Council made the loan to the Wyotech, and so therefore that $5 million that's sitting out there for reversion, that's why it hasn't been used.
Just to clarify, they made the loan, and the money's been given to the entity to utilize the loan. Is that what you just said?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Well, we can get the information, know exactly where we're at,
Yeah.
and answer Mr. Co-Chair's questions. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, back on page 19, our administration division has multiple units, so I will focus on the administration, the policy and intergovernmental cooperation. This year, through the net to zero process, we've taken the opportunity within the office to combine our administration and policy units. As I had mentioned earlier, the office works very much as a team, and there's a lot of similar expenditure when it comes to supplies, travel and et cetera, that would be more efficient if we track this as really one unit. And that's our methodology here. In this particular administration, Governor's recommendation of $7,026,342 with authorized employees of 21, including the one AWAC position.
One new position is the AWAC for the Chief Energy Policy, correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman, yeah.
And then the other question is on your contractual services. It went down a little bit, and that's an area that I'm gonna ask questions a lot. What, is that just do you have something in mind for that right now, or is that just you're just carrying forward in the standard budget because you may need it?
Mr. Chairman, I believe we're carrying that forward, is my understanding.
Kevin?
Mr. Chairman, the reduction is the one-time money that was provided to us in the previous biennium, but your standard budget is ongoing, which we plan to use to facilitate the office.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Go ahead, you got a question?
So just in general, Buck, I do have a question. We've got our state agency vacancies and what positions that are open. It looks to me like the governor's office has 5 positions open right now. Would that be fair?
Go ahead, Buck.
Mr. Chairman, excuse me.
This has practicing attorney 3, a governor's assistant staff, 2 executive management 3 levels, and a bunch of analysts.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I believe at this time we're tracking.
Mr. Co-Chairman, while they're looking, can you tell me where you are, on what page are we on?
It's on page 1
Oh,
of.
you're on the,
This one.
Go ahead, Buck.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
Mr. Co-Chairman, we do have, we have a practicing attorney 3 we're actively recruiting and accepting applications for. We have 1 administrative staff that we're actively recruiting and accepting applications for. We're currently interviewing for an executive management, which is another policy advisor that we're currently interviewing for. And I believe those are the 3 that we're, that
Go ahead, Erica.
Mr. Chairman, Chief, the other 2, I believe, are Homeland Security, so you're correct in the 3
Okay.
that you
Okay,
analyzed.
so it's 3 in the governor's office.
3 in the governor's.
And so my just question is, you believe you need those positions as opposed to, and then adding the AWAC versus just transferring one over to the other, and in terms of having a full and complete staff?
Well, and to follow on to that too, one of them's been open for 11 months. And maybe you could do it internally and eliminate a position. That would be the question.
And Mr. Coach, I would add that, and you probably are aware, that we eliminated 1 position in the governor's office that went effective when you came into office, Governor, so it was nothing vindictive about it. It was just cost savings.
Whoa.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, the addition of the 1 AWAC on the Chief Energy Advisor position, just to clarify that, we felt we really, that the state really needed a person that had a lot of federal experience, DC experience, along with being an accomplished energy professional, and that's, we felt like we were kind of strapped by not having that relationship necessarily with the folks back in DC. So that was our thinking there, and it's really worked out thus far, very beneficial to the state and for our office. As far as the other policy advisor position, this is just, we do feel like we probably need one more position in the office to make it complete. We're still running pretty lean. We feel like we're staffing up well in the natural resource and energy area. but we do have other areas that, obviously, human services and some of the other areas that could
I think,
benefit.
in the request from your agency, there were 127 new positions is a number that sticks in my mind of the requests that you were given by your agency, our agencies, and that was reduced considerably. And Don, go ahead. No, go ahead and finish. What I was going to ask the question of the 127, if any of those were in fact unfilled positions or any of that, just for cross-reference. The request on the exception budget was 127 new employees. And if that, anyway, is that in addition to this, subsequent to this, are there any included in this?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that is all in addition, and I believe it's accurate to say that the governor denied a majority of those
yeah.
127.
I knew that. Okay, go ahead.
And Mr. Chairman and Mr. Co-Chairman, I just learned that the one advisor, the executive management position, is actually our former energy advisor, that was now moved to the policy director. So that position has in fact not been vacant for 11 months. There's an inaccuracy on this.
Okay.
Did you get that, Don?
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I have a couple questions on this exception request. One is, it's odd that it's an AWAC, I had to confirm that it's odd that you have an AWAC position. And then two, the cost of the position. So one, why is it an AWAC if it's an ongoing position? And then two, the cost of that position, is that the normal cost for a policy advisor in your office?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, and Representative Summers. First of all, this was a new position, not an authorized position. The reason we went out to contract on that. Regarding the salary, to find and gain the experience that was required for this position, this was really, well, it seems possibly a little bit exorbitant. It's really, we're very fortunate in finding an individual that could fill this role for that level. That's really about the way you size it up. As I indicated earlier, this is the continual challenge that we face in these policy positions to find people who I mean, they are writing and developing policy with the governor. So,
Mr. Chairman, if I could address Mr. Co-Chairman and Representative Summers, it has been clear to me that there are a number of states, Washington has 2, Alaska has 1, and other states have full-time representation in Washington, D.C. The individual we asked for with this AWAC position has a tremendous amount of experience in D.C., but chooses to live in Wyoming. So there are no additional sunk costs with a lobbying office or a lobbying contract or anything else. And yet, we still have access to pretty much the highest levels of government and an incredibly talented individual who I think has already demonstrated his value to the industry and to the state in this process. This was an effort to be economic in getting our presence better known in D.C. and to be able to advocate for the state and the state's positions. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead, Representative Summers.
So, Mr. Chairman, just to follow up on the AWAC piece of that, I still didn't really understand why the position was classified as an AWAC.
Mr. Chairman, this AWAC position was originally established through a B11, and the governor has authority to establish a B11. Doesn't have authority to establish an ongoing position. If an agency or the governor's office likes to cross biennium or wish to cross biennium, then they ask for that position, and in this case, they asked for the position classification they had. We would not be resistant to a full-time position in the governor's office for this. The only difference is the retirement portion isn't an at-will contract employee. So there's a small differential in cost.
Okay. Continuing, and while you're doing it, we've talked, the governor, you and I talked about in terms of the, once again, back to coal, the IRPs in other states that buy Wyoming coal, where there's been some effort, and the governor, your staff has supported that, where we've been able to go out there and intervene in those IRPs through the, I believe we did it, I think we did it through the Infrastructure Authority budgets, and how we did that to solicit these people. And they've been very successful in millions of dollars of revenues to the state, because in the IRP intervention, they extended the life of those coal-fired power plants. If they want to do more of that, I think it's great for Wyoming. Where in your budget do you have the sufficient money that might be under contract service? Because I think that's money well spent. I think the numbers I thought was $38 million a year in royalties to the state of Wyoming, income to the state by extending the life of those coal-fired power plants. You have that in your budget.
Mr. Chairman, we asked for $1 million in my budget for that purpose. It's not in this governor's office budget.
Okay, so it's out there, and all right.
That is correct.
Thank you. I should know that. Should have picked that up, but it sounds better if I ask and you tell me. Makes a lot more sense. Okay.
All right, Mr. Chairman. Pages 20 and 21 just basically provide the unit narrative for what we've just discussed. Again, the standard budget, which the governor recommends approval of, and the AWEC funding request for the chief energy advisor. The governor also recommends approval of that. So with that, that puts us on to page 22. Under the unit budget request for the administration, this table, total funding request of $6,765,317. And I think we can probably skip through these pages to probably 25. Let's go to page 26. And this piece is where it identifies the $5 million that we just discussed for the Auto Tech Trade School grant. And this is a one-time funding request that slated to end June 30th, 2020. So we turn to page 27, to the intergovernmental cooperation, the unit narrative. Mr. Chairman and Mr. Co-Chairman, this appropriations, as it says here, is used to pay for the Education Commission of the states, National Governors Association, and Western Governors Association membership. We believe these memberships are beneficial to our office as well as state government in general. State agencies such as WYDOT, Homeland Security, the Enterprise Technology Division, they've attended seminars and conferences on topics that range from future transportation, electric vehicles, to participating in cybersecurity workshops. We feel like this is a money well spent. I can tell you from experience coming into this office as a new administration with just like deer in the headlights, I guess. We're looking at what do we do next, and the National Governors Association was very, very helpful in helping us along in that.
Well, I think the NGA and the WGA are very important for our state. I wonder about the Education Commission of the States. How much is that for the two-year cycle? The dues amount? And, you know, I know there's members of the legislature. Do we have any, what are the benefits we get out of that? That's one of the ones I wonder about. Do we need to be involved in that?
Mr. Chairman, while I can't speak totally on this, I know that our office was recently awarded a $100,000 grant. Well, this is from NGA, excuse me, for the the Educate for Opportunity project. So I don't know if, can anyone speak on that? Education Commission?
Mr. Chairman, Chief McVeigh. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, Chief McVeigh, if that's something that we can get back to the committee on, we would be happy to do that.
Thank you.
And Don, well, he left, but from the legislative perspective, our cost, I know our state senator participates. Who's the state representative? You know who it is? Okay. All right, go ahead. Yes. President Walter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But could we back up to page 26 on the auto tech trade school? And I just want to make sure I'm understanding what was stated earlier in the morning. The $5 million that's here on page 26 will revert at the end of this biennium because it was not used, because the Business Council made a loan for the trade school, and so this money never, in this area of the budget, was never used. Is that a correct understanding, or am I totally confused?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, that is my understanding.
Okay. I think we're past page 28 now.
Mr. Chairman, this is again, back on intergovernmental cooperation here. We talked about there's no exception.
What page?
Oh, I'm sorry, on page 28. I thought.
Okay.
And Governor recommends approval of this standard budget. There are no exceptions for this division. So with that, we can move on to page, let's go to page 30. This is the unit budget request for the policy office. This year, we've combined the administration and the policy units through the net to zero process. Again, we've done this simply for the ease and efficiency of budgeting, basically. It's all standard, no exception.
You know, and Buck, on that, I mean, clearly there's a need with all the things going on in our country with rules and regulations. Don, just out of curiosity, to see the previous administrations, I think this number is consistent in the number of employees. I'm just curious where it is versus other administrations. Just grab that number for me when you get a chance. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, if we could proceed to page 31. This is the budget request summary table for the tribal liaison position. Standard budget was $166,770. And we were basically given two full-time positions, but they were only half-funded through this office. And so the exception that we're asking for in this particular case of $263,304 is we're basically asking for these two positions to be funded, fully funded.
So as I understand that, you'll have a tribal member from the northern Arapaho, one from the eastern Shoshone, and the money's in there to pay them around $107,000 per year, each individual for the biennial budget. Is that correct?
That doesn't, let's see. Mr. Chairman, can you repeat what that amount that you just?
Our numbers show it would be $107,000 per tribe for the two-year cycle per person. So that adds up to the $430. That's how we come up with that. And I think that's accurate because our staff prepared that.
Mr. Chairman, yes, and that's salary and benefits.
So I guess this is a great question for the governor. There's been a lot of debate about this in the Senate in particular. Do we need this? And I'm one that thinks that we got to have good tribal relations, but in the past, it's been abused on the tribal side, in my opinion. And quite frankly, I still think they should pay part of it, but yet again, I understand that. So I'm in favor of doing this and moving it forward. Do you have any other thoughts on it?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that. I think it's a valuable exercise to consider these positions. Quite frankly, I want to see them elevate so that there is more of an expectation of process delivery. You know, we've had conversations, a lot of things come through the newspaper that we haven't had ahead of time, and my hope is that with both the Shoshone and the Arapaho that we have much more formative conversations about our expectations, our mutual expectations, government to government. I think these positions are absolutely critical with that. Beyond that, Mr. Chairman, and I'm not prepared to really make a request at this point, but I'm mindful and I bring to the committee's attention that we now have tribal relationships with multiple tribes, that one being obviously the Shoshone and the other the Arapaho, but now we have the Shoshone Bannock and the Crow and the Navajo nations. And so our office is really trying to contemplate what that means and how we need to address all of those considerations.
Well, and Governor, we pay their salaries. And I get it that they're going to be advocates for the tribes, and that's part of it, but yet they work for you. And there's certain things we can get along with the tribes on, and we should move in that direction, but the things we disagree on, you know, I think the state should take a strong position in how this works through these two people. That's your prerogative, but we certainly don't agree on boundaries. We certainly don't agree on letting them hunt whenever they want, wherever they want. We're not going to agree on that. You know, the marijuana's coming up, at least from my perspective, I'm not going to agree with that. So there's areas there where they work for us, and we just got to try to sort through that, and it's a delicate situation, but we got to do it. We got to work with them.
Mr. Chairman, you couldn't be more accurate. You know, I've been disappointed a couple of times by, as I say, things that have come across through the newspaper. You know, hunting, expanded hunting, marijuana, you know, a number of issues that really ought to be dealt with government to government, and at least give us some you know, impression about what they're thinking about before we get very far along. I will say it's been great to work with Representative Larson in this, and my expectation is that our tribal liaisons we need to have much more direct relationship with the tribes, and I expect them to help facilitate that. So yeah, we are paying their salary, and I am hoping that on a number of these issues that they can be very, very valuable.
Mr. Co-Chair. Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think what we would like, Governor, is to have some type of reports, and we've done this before with these funding, so that we know that these representatives who are selected are working. I mean, basically it's a 40-hour work week pay if you look at the amount they're receiving, and whether or not you're getting weekly reports and how that works, so we know the money is being used effectively. Because in the past, on situational circumstances, it just wasn't working. And we can say that, well, we want to keep good relations up, but we don't want to have 2 employees in your office that have status to walk into your office anytime who aren't providing the service that we're being paid for. And that's important to us that we see that. You know, all things down the road, if they have to be held accountable just like we have to be held accountable, and it's tough to find the right positions to do that, and we acknowledge that. I mean, whether or not it's a time frame of who you pick and having a measuring and how you want to do that to us, but that's just what we want to have, so that so you're not full of, and then also it might be useful to have, after a year or two that you use these folks, to determine whether or not being a full-time employee on your behalf is more effective or less effective than having it be a shared duty where they're actually advocating versus being informative and working for you, because I think the perception of the tribes and the councils may be different when it's just your office walking in versus someone that they also are partly responsible for. We don't know the answer to that. But those things we need to continue to be receptive but I think aggressive about it, just because it's the nature of the beast to make this thing work.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, if I understand you correctly, I think I'm supporting what I think I heard you say, is that the tribes ought to find value in that relationship as well. It's not just a paid lobbyist, for lack of a better phrase, for the tribe's position. But, and I absolutely agree. I think the liaisons need to make sure that the tribes support their efforts and that they are mutually invested in the work of the liaisons. Thank you.
Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor, I'd just kind of like to see if my perception of the efforts to have relationships with our two existing tribes plus the expansion of that, as you pointed out, with the Shoshone-Bannock, the Crow, and the Navajo nations, is I think that it is sometimes a delicate balancing act. Sometimes when I get done at the end of the week, I feel like I could join the circus and be a tightrope guy as we try to maintain communications and efforts moving forward to work with not only the tribes in the state, but the federal agencies as well. But I think with the expansion this last year, I am seeing that may broaden a little more into just focusing solely on the two tribes that exist on the Wind River Indian Reservation. And that may expand how you look at it from your office, and which is something that while we fund the liaisons this year and pursue that, how that looks after that might be different depending on how we sit down and figure out how to have a more broad engagement with outside what we have traditionally had. Is that the way you're seeing it?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, and Representative Larson, yes, it is. I think the relationship we have with the tribes, generally speaking, is something that we need to be much more clear about what our expectations are. And I think to your point, that is a work in progress for us. This is, the liaisons have a traditional capacity, and we've talked about that, but our relationships, government to government, really need to take a step up. You know, clearly there are areas of mutual interest. I know in conversations that I've had with AJ Not Afraid, tribal leader, and on the Crow Agency, he's clearly interested in trying to figure out ways that we can promote economic development between the state and the tribe. That seems to be an interest of other tribes as well. And so from my standpoint, this is an evolving capacity in the governor's office. Thank you.
Yeah, and Governor, the other thing, getting back to what Co-Chairman Nicholas talked about, I think that would be prudent. And when I would look at it, you know, there's a lot of things that we're really working together on, and we should follow up, like the Medicaid, you know, that we did with a waiver that took us 2 or 3 years to get done, but when we got it, it's been really helpful to everybody involved. We're working on DFS now with how we provide service to those young Native American kids and what we do there, and negotiate and all that. It'd be neat to see the 6, 7, 8, 9 items or whatever it is, that where we are and what we're doing. And you can also put on their boundaries a big no. Again, no, but anyway, I think that'd be helpful. You know, we're going to try to get through this by noon, Buck, so go ahead. Continue, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Co-Chairman, If there's no more discussion on the tribal liaison at this time, let's skip to page, let's actually skip to page 37, discussion on the unit narrative for the Commission on Uniform Laws. There's a standard budget request in here of $94,903 for this program. And it's basically used to promote uniformity laws and to make recommendation to state legislatures. Wyoming Commission currently has 3 members appointed by the governor that sits on this. Really, it's a standard budget we recommend approval of, and there are no exceptions.
Go ahead.
Thanks, but could you, it mentions there that there's periodically lifetime members. Do we have any current lifetime members? How many and who might they be?
Mr. Chairman, I don't believe I can answer that one.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I've got the names of the individuals who we have on there. I'm not sure of their time frame on those. I can find out. We have Keith Couts, Anthony Whitland, and Phil Nicholas, who are on there. So I don't know what their status is as far as time frame on that, but I can find out.
3 of them?
There's 3 of them.
And then do we, Mr. Chairman, if I may, so what, I'm just kind of curious as to why we do, what's the criteria or the basis behind doing lifetime members? Do you see any? Please.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Representative Larson, at the risk of sounding like I know more than I do, to my knowledge, the 3 commissioners we have are the only ones that are there from Wyoming at this point. It strikes me that from time to time, people may be selected for lifetime memberships. I'm not aware of any from Wyoming that have been appointed for lifetime memberships, but let me get back to you on that.
So, Mr. Chairman, so those 3 are not from Wyoming, is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Representative Larson, all 3 of the commissioners that we have, every state provides commissioners. The 3 that we have serve varying terms, and I believe they're appointed for a 3-year, and they can serve a couple of different terms. So Tony Wentland preceded Phil Nicholas. Phil Nicholas is the most recent appointment appointed by Governor Meade, and then Keith Couts, Justice Couts is on the commission as well. Thank you.
Okay, Governor, I know you've got something that you need to be at here, and we sure want to keep you on your schedule. When you leave, we'll come up with all kinds of ideas that you may not like. No. But anyway, Governor, you certainly, if you would like to leave, we understand. And our First Lady is waiting in the wings. So what I'd like to do, Governor, is I don't like saying you're excused, but you are excused. And thank you for being here. We appreciate it. Look forward to working with you. And Buck, we'll just, if we could bring the First Lady in, that works for you, and then we'll get back to your budget. So let's bring the First Lady in. I believe she's there. And welcome, Jennie Gordon, to the JAC. Come on in. Well, welcome. Great to see you, and thank you so much for your initiative you're taking on as our First Lady. They're just a great area, and what you've done is really appreciated by a lot of people. So thank you for that. You know, we saved all the tough questions for you. So welcome, and the floor is yours, and we're anxious to hear what you have to say.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Jennie Gordon, and I am your First Lady. Very honored to be so, and it is a privilege. I come before you today to present the governor's residence budget. And if it's the pleasure of the committee, I will start with the state of the agency, and we'll walk page by page through our budget. The governor's residence operates with a biennial budget of $588,180. We have 2 authorized full-time staff, and the governor's residence includes both private and public use areas. The governor's residence provides both the site and building to be used exclusively for the resident of the governor during his time in office. The public use areas serve to provide the setting for special events hosted by the governor and first spouse. The governor's residence operates with 2 divisions. The Division 0100, which is residence operations, provides funding for essential operations of the residence. Division 200, which is the China and food service equipment repair or replacement, is a way to replace and repair china, crystal, or any appliances for the residents. The most significant challenge for the residents is adequate funding in order to meet the high standards the public would expect of a governor's residence. Our priorities are the residence operation of $583,255 and the China food service replacement of $4,925, which equals that budget of $588,180. We have the division budget request summary, which is the 100 series personnel, which is $308,842. The 200 series, which is supportive services, at $94,028. The 400 series, which is data services, at $20,730. And the 900 series, which is our contractual services, at $159,655. The governor's office has recommended approval of our standard budget, and we do not expect any exception requests. With that, I'm prepared to answer any questions.
Well, thank you for that, members of the Joint Appropriations Committees. Any questions? There being no, go ahead. Go ahead, Representative Nicholas,
Thank you,
Mr. Co-Chair.
Mr. Co-Chair. Welcome. And welcome to the governor's chalet or condominium, because it's not really a governor's mansion, and it's not really a residence. And as you probably know, it's one of my agendas is to get a real governor's residence one of these days. But if you have problems or different issues with the residence, in particular your living quarters, please feel free to speak freely with us, however you feel, because we want to take care of it. And I know it's a beautiful grounds, but it's right next to the interstate. It can be noisy on occasion. It's not, it really looks like the residence looks like a condominium you're at in Steamboat for about $500 a night. It's not really a residence, and I apologize for that. And thank you for making it your home while you're there, because it's all we got. But I just want you to know that don't feel constrained by the budget that you present to us. And we really want to, and if you need furnishings, whatever you need, just let us know, because it really is important that we use the residence as the people's house and as a representation of an open door policy into the friendship, but also just the community of Wyoming. And we really appreciate you being there and allowing us to come visit on occasion. So thanks.
Thank you, Representative. And we actually are quite comfortable there and very honored to be able to live in the People's House. And we want to make sure it is the People's House and that there's opportunity for residents to come and see the public side at various times.
Thank you. Representative Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam First Lady, we would just like to express our appreciation. You spent your Thanksgiving holiday with our troops. And as you mentioned, you are our First Lady, and having you do that is a big deal to us. And so let us just say thank you.
Well, thank you. It was an honor, and our guardsmen and women are doing wonderful work over there, and they're very proud of what they're doing, and there were no complaints about them being away from their families. They were happy to be there and doing the work.
Anybody else have any other questions? I would echo, Madam First Lady, what Co-Chairman Nicholas said, that, you know, anything that you see or need, and that we're there to help and do what we can. And I hadn't thought of it as a condominium. I don't want the people out there to think that our governor and First Lady live in a condominium, but they do. The other, do you, on a personal note, on the security side, you know, there's things that have gone out there, and we've done some things to help the security. You feel comfortable, quite frankly, where you are there and with the security involved?
Yes, absolutely. I know they've upgraded a lot of the cameras, and the staff that the Division O are very wonderful. They're very professional, and they take very good care of us, and are there, you know, if we have any needs, they are always willing to help us. So we are very grateful for them.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and we appreciate you inviting us out and spending time with you. And on a side note, several governors ago, and it kind of talks about how long I've been doing this, but invited us out and served us peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. The message was, we got the message, so.
Well, hopefully Becky will bring you something better than that next time.
If you have peanut butter and jelly, have them on whole wheat, not white bread. Okay, any other questions of our First Lady or staff? Thank you very much. We appreciate what you do, and you are our First Lady, and we're there to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor.
We're not standing up for you, Buck. Okay.
Buck, I'll stand up.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll resume on page 39. And this is division budget table for the coal conversion technologies. Got a base budget of $500,000, but we're not recommending anything here. In the near future, the governor will be releasing a request for proposal to evaluate, analyze, and prepare testimony concerning the economic assumptions and findings within the Rocky Mountain Power Integrated Resource Plan that they will be presenting to the Public Service Commission. Under the current schedule, the money will be obligated in January of 2020. And this is all part of the big package for coal marketing and for energy commercialization that I believe the governor spoke a little bit on during his presentation earlier this morning. We recommend approval. There's no exceptions. If there's no questions there, we will move on to the, let's go to, on page 42, special contingency. We have a standard budget recommendation of $443,275 with an exception request of $556,725, bringing the governor's recommendation, total recommendation, to $1 million. Governor recommends approval. Excuse me.
Could you just, is that more than the standard amount, or is it bringing it back up to the standard amount in terms of the funding?
Mr. Chairman, that's bringing it up to the $1 million mark.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, to provide a little bit more information, a couple bienniums ago, it was $1 million. We're bringing it back to that. We did experience, during the austere times, necessity to kind of lower that, but this request brings it back to the point to where it once was.
And what are any restrictions or specific directives on the use of the fund? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, historically, these funds have been used for for fires, some flooding situations. It's also been used to, they've also been used to help mitigate some effects from tornadoes and epidemics such as grasshoppers and other.
So then the question, you have other disaster relief funds, so what's the purpose of increasing it if you've got 10 million in the fire account or and one of those other numbers? What's the rationale?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that this particular fund helps us facilitate those situations in an immediate fashion and leverage FEMA dollars, for example, or other federal dollars that become available. So we're not standing this up simply to address a particular issue. We're standing this up so that we can be in the ballgame immediately to facilitate other sources of funding.
Buck,
Go ahead, Representative Summers.
question, Bob,
Go ahead.
you got anything?
Well, we had Representative Summers first, and we'll come
All
back.
right.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. My question is, when was this last at $1 million?
Mr. Chairman, I think it was 2013, 2012, 2013 biennium, 2011, 2012. Thank you.
Senator?
Mr. Chair, Buck, real question on this is the way this is structured, it says these are gonna be grant payments, but just a question on those grants, are they 100% grant when these emergencies occur, or is there a policy in place in the governor's office? It's a grant loan mix or matching fund mix or anything like that, or other federal funds? I'm just curious as to the policy on how these would be administered if they're grants, and do we go to the federal funds first, and then if there's, this would basically be the fund of last resort, as I understand it.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Senator Hicks, I would, since I haven't been party to this, I would defer this question to Director Hibbard to see if he can answer that.
Mr. Chairman, that is the intent. When we get into these situations, we try to get on the ground as soon as possible and identify those sources of revenue available to the state of Wyoming. FEMA, for example, it's a really tough thing on the front end of this to manage that, but through the process, we continually try to leverage these funds to meet the final answer, or like you said, this would be the last resort of funding. But normally, you can always expect when we're in these situations that there's other funds that are associated with these efforts.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, is any of this current money going to revert, or is this fund used entirely up this?
Which one you on, Eydie?
Or up till now? We still have a little time.
The emergency response increase.
Mr. Chairman, the intent would be to have this $1 million available, and then those funds that are not in here would be subject to reversion unless we otherwise ask for those to be carried forward. But our target is to have this $1 million for the upcoming biennium.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, sorry, I didn't make my answer clearer. How much do we have right now in this pot of money? I guess that would be.
Mr. Chairman, give me a couple seconds and I'll be able to tell you what that contingency fund has a balance in.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead,
Mr. Co-Chairman, I have in here that the ending balance of fiscal 2019 is $443,275.
So, just to follow up, I'm not sure of the logic of having anything revert. I mean, because you're going to want it the next year and the next year. So,
Mr. Chairman, the way this is currently written is that we would revert the funds that would be on the table at June, whatever those happen to be, and then this $1 million would come back in, and then we'd have a $1 million part for the following biennium, but the residual amounts would revert.
so it reverts and it comes right back.
It may, but we don't know what we're going to be involved with between now and the end of June. It's kind of a challenge to try to say we want $1 million for the upcoming biennium. We could say something along the line, revert any unobligated, unexpended amount up to the million, then after that have it profiled for $1 million. But now you see the challenges of trying to create a profile to this. So we could say revert and then only use of what that $1 million is up to what the reversions didn't cover. But then you get into the profile situation where we're trying to be transparent. We've profiled $1 million for this program for 21-22, and whatever takes place between now and the end of this biennium will reduce the amount that's available if we have expenditures. If not, that remaining amount of money will revert.
Okay, anything else? Continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So with that, the governor recommends approval of this exception request for $556,725. And given that we have Director Bud ready to stand by on Homeland Security, we can skip from page 43 to page, I have 84. And this brings up the unit narrative for the natural resource policy account for NERPA. And as we've previously discussed with this particular funding, this has always been an exception request.
So, Buck, before you go on.
Yes, sir.
So what's the difference between the special contingency account, or is there, and the emergency response? They're the same thing, 42 and 45?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that is just a semantical thing.
Yeah.
I think that's what one page was calling it the contingency, and the other one was the emergency. Thank you. So on page 84, the explanation under the unit narrative of the FNRPA account, and as you'll see, an exception budget request of $1 million is recommended for the fiscal 21-22 biennium. I don't know that there's, as we talked about earlier, also the legislative reports that go along with the FNRPA funding, particularly with all the cases of its use, were identified on pages 13 through 18. That I said it, if it was the committee's pleasure, we could go back to, but I don't know if.
Well, clearly,
that's your pleasure.
this is an important account, and it does not revert. And you know, you have a surplus, the way I look at this, of roughly over $1 million, so you've got a $2 million budget, so.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, the current balance as of, maybe not, at the preparation of this report, stood at $3,650,037. So with this $1 million, this is to truss this account up that much more for.
So what's it again, 3 million, did you?
Mr. Chairman, it's $3,650,037.
Well, we're either overfunding it or we're not doing our job with that amount of money. I didn't realize it was that high.
Mr. Chairman, I think the important aspect of this is that we're talking currently, this conversation has been on expenditure and budgeting, not incorporating encumbrances of these funds that we have with the local governments already. When you make those encumbrances, and this is an opportunity, I believe, for the budget division to do a better job, or at least do a different type of job on these to show encumbrances, because just expenditures and revenue doesn't show where you're encumbered. We do believe that we're going to be fully encumbered on that prior funding, and those contracts are set up on a reimbursement basis with the local governments, where once upon a time we used to forward the cash to them. We no longer do that. We have the encumbrances, and the local governments bill us, and then we pay them out of the encumbrances. So if you include encumbrances, we're largely going to be talking about $1 million in the upcoming biennium.
Well, I get that, Kevin, but these encumbrances were there before in previous budgets as well. You still seem to build the money up as it, to get to this level, but that would help to break it down. What happens, quite frankly, is everybody so supportive of FNRPA that we just want to be sure it's funded, and I think
yes,
you can make an argument that it's overfunded.
Mr. Chairman, my argument is the $3.6 million does not reflect encumbrances that are in existence out there that we will pay through time when we get the bills.
Well, so what you're saying then, Kevin, it's more of a timing issue because we had them in the past, but the timing hasn't occurred to facilitate the encumbered funds as part of the 360. Just get us that information then, and what that might be. And if it's going to be an encumbrance that goes on, maybe that should be a standard budget. I don't know.
Well,
Get that to us.
Mr. Chairman, the rule of encumbrances is once we have the contracts with the local governments in this case, then those encumbrances automatically cross the biennium so that we can pay when we get the bills. That's an encumbrance conversation, not a cash balance conversation. When you see the $3.6 million, that's a cash balance, but that does not reflect what we will be paying the local governments when they bill us.
Well, I get that, and that's what I want to know is what that number is so we can see that.
Absolutely. I agree with you, and I think also in the future to be able to show it on this table reflected that way.
Yes, Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. First of all, you know, this program is really important in my area of the world and where I live with so much federal land. And I do know the governor has changed his process to kind of a twice a year, but that doesn't mean that you can't submit a request as you may need it. And I just want to emphasize that I hope that continues because these requests are not, they can come at any time. We don't know when a document can be filed that needs to be responded to. And so I hope you maintain flexibility in that program for local governments to be able to use this, and that we don't get so bureaucratic that we can't utilize the funds that are needed out there. So once again, thanks for having the program and funding the program. And Senator Hicks and I have been talking about this for a little while as well. So, thank you.
And while we're talking about a question for you, Representative Summers, and you know, there's other areas, you know, where money's spent, particularly in the grizzly bear. I know we use some of this funding for the grizzly bear management issues. Is that not correct? We've been doing that?
Yeah. Yes.
You're nodding yes, so, okay. Go ahead, Senator Hicks, you got a question?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and just to add on to Representative Summers, I think it's a tremendously valuable program. But recently I've had some concerns brought to my attention of just the delay in time getting back to the encumbrances from the time that those funds were approved, most of them under the last administration. The bills are being submitted and they're not being reimbursed in a timely fashion. So in addition to the request on just the encumbrances, I guess one of the things that I'd like to, if that data is available, is to see when those requests for reimbursement come in and actually, you know, when they're going out. Because what happens is, you have alluded to already, these are reimbursements. And so, you know, given the nature of the counties and the conservation districts that are contributing funds to these, a lot of times they just can't sit on that for 2 or 3 or 4 months. So just as an FYI, it's been brought to my attention, it's a concern and the delay and the amount of time that it's taken to get those reimbursements processed and backed out.
Mr. Chairman, we'd be happy to provide that information to Senator Hicks. And Senator Hicks, I also would opine that in my previous life at the Department of Transportation, managing a $1.4 billion program, it clearly is the objective to get these reimbursements out on the street as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I know just the transition of administrations has caused some delays. That's expected, but just as an FYI, if we can get that information, it would be very beneficial. Thank you.
You know, while we're talking about this too, and although it's, you know, in the new administration, the Gordon administration, Buck, it'd be interesting to see the difference in the impact we've had working with our counties with the new administration in Washington compared to the previous one that was, in my opinion, very bad for our state. So maybe if you could shine some light on that, nothing to report or anything. I think it's been helpful, and we're working and we're making a lot more progress than we would have previously. Okay, let's go ahead and get through this.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have 2 more divisions, pretty much uncomplicated ones. On page 87, the endangered species. We're asking for the standard budget of $1,226,780. No exceptions. recommendation of $1,226,780.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Larry. Excuse me, Senator Hicks.
If we could get a copy of what those projects, I know one of the things, and we looked at this a couple of years ago, there was a lot of money being spent on surveying species through the Game and Fish Department, and I think it would be enlightening to the committee is to see what's actually being spent out of that account. So if you've got a detailed accounting on that, I think that would be helpful. It sure seemed to me there was a lot of duplicative efforts that we were paying the Game and Fish Department to collect data that they probably should have already been collecting on their own budget. But just curious if that's changed as we go forward on how those funds are going to be allocated out for those, quote, research purposes. So anyway, I think it would be helpful to see what we've done in the past.
Go ahead, Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, on that note, just to know that, you know, people up in my area were a beneficiary of this in that federal agency was kind of coming after grazing permits on a boreal toad issue. And the governor's office did step in with this money to help do surveys, just like the good senator was talking about, that nobody really thought they ever had to do, right? And so some of it is, it's just, you never know what's going to pop up when. And so it was very beneficial at one point, I know, in my area.
No, and Mr. Chairman,
ahead,
just to
Senator Hicks.
reiterate, I think that some of that's been good, but I also saw some of the stuff that had been done in the past that was not endangered species. It was more what I would call non-game wildlife surveys that built a database, but I don't even believe they were candidate species that's been used in the past. I'm just concerned to make sure that we're targeting what the endangered species account's really for.
Okay, the only other thing I would add is when I look at this, the effects of land use on sensitive species, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that they would consider, especially our own university, multiple use and sustained yield. Okay, any questions on this? We're now at that point where we're at Homeland Security, and it's about 5 minutes till 12. What's your pleasure, Mr. Co-Chair? Do you want to just have an early lunch and come back right after lunch or get started? Yeah, let's get started. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Bud.
Mr. Chairman, there was one last division that we needed to discuss here, and that's the baseline scientific assessment. And again, it's just a standard budget request, no exceptions. And this is just basically used for the building of the GIS clearinghouse.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you
Homeland
very
Security. Homeland Security. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Committee. I'm Lynn Budd. I'm the Director of the Office of Homeland Security for the state of Wyoming. I have with me today Deputy Director Leland Christensen, whom I believe all of you know, and also some staff with me for support for financial. Ashley Paulsrud, who's our Grants and Finance Section Chief, Linda Myers, who's our Accounting Analyst, and our Preparedness Section Chief, Spencer Pollard, which are all right there now.
Well, welcome, Lynn.
Thank
It's good
you.
to have you here.
Thank you. I will just start out real quickly on page 6 with our agency overview. We are within the governor's office and perform the duties of Homeland Security, including functions related to emergency management. We have a figure there of 82% federal funds, but with some adjustments to our budget, we're actually at about 86% federal funds. We have some matching funds that are responsible for getting that federal money. Some of that is cash in the general fund, as well as in-kind match to secure these federal funds. Quick overview of our agency. These are some of the major program areas that we cover, including emergency preparedness, intelligence and information sharing, critical infrastructure protection. There's 16 different sectors of critical infrastructure that we work with, including energy. We work in response, recovery, and mitigation. I will make a quick clarification on the word mitigation and our use. It is the reduction of consequences of natural disasters up front, not a trade-off as mitigation is used in other arenas, so if that makes sense. Agency challenges and risks. We are in the process of integrating 3 members of FEMA into our offices. There's a team lead, a public assistance recovery type person, and they have just hired a GIS analyst that will be at our service, if you will. All of those people are intended to help us learn as well as make those connections with FEMA and make those more seamless so that we can get better results for our state. And we've also been working on 2 major plans. One of those is a long-term power outage plan, as well as a cyber incident response annex. And both of those plans are complete with the knowledge that every plan is a living plan and changes are made as needed as we go along. The long-term power outage plan, we worked in conjunction with the National Guard and the Public Service Commission, as well as the private sector. With regard to the cyber response plan, we worked with ETS, National Guard, WYDOT, DCI, and the WIAT, which is the Wyoming Information and Analysis Team, which is our fusion center in the DCI. Agency successes in 2017, and we're seeing the results of this. We moved the Homeland Security training program from the Law Enforcement Academy in Douglas to our office in order to reduce some of the overhead costs and ability to deliver that training program across the state. We reduced the FTEs from 3 FTEs there to 1.5. And then as we have been doing through an agency review and reorganization, we're addressing some span of control issues as well as finding other efficiencies in our agency. All right, I'm going to jump to page 46, which is our complete budget within the governor's budget. A couple of notations there. You'll see that, once again, we do have an exception request in for a full-time position. However, this is really not a new position. In previous budget maneuvers, a position was made a temporary position instead of a full-time position. So we have an employee who is working full-time, who is our face of the agency. It's our administrative assistant at the front desk, who answers all of our phone calls and all of our the door, as well as taking care of other sensitive documents for us and supporting the training program. This position is currently being filled with an express employee, and since 2015, we have had 8 people in that position. Not only do we not have the opportunity to vet that person for security purposes, but that also, if you just assume 3 months to train a new person, that means in the last 4 years, we've spent 2 years training. So we do not have any kind of budget request as far as additional funds for this. It's just movement of the money from the 900 series to the 100 series. So we feel like this is very important to the continuity of our agency as well as the security of our agency. And again, we would make that request. Okay, oh, and you might note the $500,000 in the governor's exception changes. Due to an input error, the $500,000 is our disaster contingency fund, which is normally an exception request. It was incorrectly put into the standard budget, so that's why that's being removed. As we get to that page, we'll talk more about that, but essentially that's more of a budget adjustment here than it is an actual reduction in funding for us. Okay, so page 47, it actually says Homeland Security, but this is our Emergency Management Performance Grant, which funds the majority of our agency. It is a 50-50 matching grant, 50% federal funds, 50% match. We do match with some general funds as well as in-kind match, which includes the cost of our building as well as volunteer hours for training. This grant does, once again, basically fund our agency to a majority of the employees, but it also passes through to the counties. We have the ability to fund some of the emergency management positions or 50% of the emergency management position for their salaries at the local level. That is an application process from the counties, and it does have to be non-budgeted cost for them. So in other words, it's meant to supplement, not supplant a position at the local level, so.
Mr.
Just a
Chair.
second, go ahead, Mr. Co-Chair.
So, thank you. I'm just curious about this. I'm looking at, it looks like the fund is reduced by a third since the 17-18 budget. But what I don't see is a reduction. I mean, it doesn't really change your overall budget. So so I'm just curious how much, and it's a 50-50 match, how much of it is in kind versus budget items? And is there a mechanism that we can maximize the in-kind to minimize our general fund contribution?
Go ahead.
And what do you do to do that?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I believe we have squeezed about every dollar out of in-kind that we can find at this point in time. We've been very innovative as far as using the training time as in-kind amounts. And I will let Ashley, the Grants and Finance Chief, go ahead and let you know on that percentage as far as what's general fund versus in-kind.
Welcome.
Thank you, Mr.
Pull that close so we can hear you.
Okay. I'm usually a loud talker, so hopefully you can hear me. Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman, I'm Ashley Paulsrud. I'm the Grants and Finance Section Chief for WOES. Currently, we use about 50% of our match is in kind. About 50% is cash from the general fund.
So those two, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, that makes up the 50%, so half of 25%.
That was, you confused me, you said 50% twice.
Yes.
Make sure I understand it. Say it one more time.
Yes, so
please.
so the grant is a 50-50 grant. So we have 50% federal funds, 50% match. Of that match, half of our match is cash, half of the match is in kind.
And to get back to the chairman, the co-chairman's question, gone down from 6.3 to 4.4. It's been done proportionally, or is it because we can come up with our 50% of the 50%?
Mr. Chairman, some of this is due to funding that is being provided from the federal level. All of our grants are annual grants that we have to apply for. The funding provided to our state has been reduced over time, for
So
sure.
what you're saying is we had the in-kind to be able to put forward, but the federal dollars were not there.
In some cases, yes, sir.
Go ahead, Representative Larson.
Thank you, Director Bud, it says that a portion of the funding comes through local emergency. Are they able to use in-kind as well?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Representative Larson, yes, the local level is able to use in-kind funds as well.
So then just to follow up on my question, then, if we've lost a little over $2 million since 2017-18, half of that would be matching, and so has your budget then proportionately declined based upon those less funds, or are we covering it with other resources?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Ashley just pointed out to me also in this current budget year, because of the new accounting system, we have moved some of the funds that were in this unit to another unit, 1111, to account for that in-kind portion of bills paid. So part of the budget reduction is because that got moved to another unit.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Hicks, or just a second, go ahead, Kevin.
during the austerity cuts of 2016, the Budget Division and the Office of Homeland Security went into a pretty deep dive on fully capturing all in-kind contributions available. So we went through that process. We actually provided documents to the legislature on that because it was confusing how we were accomplishing that particular effort. But we have worked and collaborated to get the maximum amount of in-kind contributions available that the federal government allows.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hicks.
Yeah, Director Bud, I'm assuming when we talk about emergency management, these EMG grants, that would include wildfire mitigation, does not include wildfire. That comes through another federal program, is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Senator Hicks, correct, yes. The wildfire mitigation, well, partially. So FMAG, the FEMA management fire management assistance grants, that's what it is, help with the response on the fire, then we actually manage mitigation funds that will help with, say, debris management or other things, fire mitigation afterwards.
But
So
these,
that's a separate fund, I'm sorry.
yeah, and I understand those as far as the bear funds and all that, how that works, but, so these couldn't be used upfront for community planning for potential wildfire mitigation, cannot be used for that, that's correct?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Senator Hicks, yes, planning is an allowable expense under this grant.
And the reason I ask that question is because we continue to get requests from communities to do planning for wildfire mitigation as that it impacts, and we're paying 100% of those costs of those studies right now through the Water Development Program. So I'm just trying to figure out if there's a mechanism here where we could use 50% federal dollars for those community wildfire protection plans. Now, they're not actual for the activities, but for the planning side of that.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Senator Hicks, I'll open up another door, in which we'll be talking about later as well, and that is some new mitigation funding that will be coming from FEMA. Congress has appropriated actually quite a large percentage, 6% of all disaster funding will be put into a mitigation fund that's nationally competitive. In 2021, that money will begin to be available, and that money could also be used for that purpose.
All right, thank you.
Okay,
Okay, let's see. So once again, we'll move to page 48, taking a look at that mix of funding. Again, I would request that the temporary position be simply moved to a full-time position with no additional funding requests attached to it.
So, Mr. Chair,
go ahead.
so even though there's no additional funding, if they become a full-time employee, then you're going to have benefits and retirement and those type of things. And on page 48, it suggests that that's a 50-50 split from federal and state, which means that there almost has to be additional funding from state dollars unless you're taking other general fund dollars from someplace else. And it will grow over time for that person as they get pay raises, increased contributions, that type of thing. Is that?
Mr. Chairman, the current amount that we are spending for this temporary position is, the funding for that position is coming out of this fund. So the 50-50 match is already there. So I would suppose, yes, down the line, you could be looking at increases as the gracious legislature gives us all raises and increases all of our income. But right now, it's a matching amount that's already there, so.
Anything else? Okay,
Okay, page 49 is let's see, wait. Excuse me, I'm gonna go to page 52, please. Page 52 is Unit 1102, which is our Community Assistance Program. This is the position in our office that handles the National Flood Insurance Program. There are no requests for additional funding in here. This is a 75-25 matching grant, which we have funding for at this time.
is this being utilized?
Yes, sir, we do have a full-time position that works with communities to work through their flood insurance issues as well as marketing for flood insurance. We are also not within this fund, but looking at marketing for earthquake insurance as, we're trying to create more resilient communities and help them to be better prepared for disasters. 19 participating counties and 66 participating municipalities. It's worth noting that a county can be a participant and a town doesn't have to, or the reverse, a town may be a participant even within a county that doesn't participate. Participation means that they're going to issue permits for building and things in the floodplains and to be watching for those as well as just relationships with the National Flood Insurance Program.
It looks like it's about pretty much all federal funds, isn't it? Two-thirds, one-third maybe?
Yep, 75-25, yes.
75-25. I know that they're participating. Are homeowners actually getting the insurance?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that there is a large amount of policies, and it is also of note that you do not have to be within a floodplain to get flood insurance. Anybody can get flood insurance, which is actually advisable, as most insurance does not cover natural events. It only covers human-caused events. So, for instance, we messed up and our sprinkler flooded our basement at one point in time. That was covered because we made the mistake. If it had been a flood because of rain or something else, it would not have been covered.
Okay, what we're gonna do, we're gonna shut down for lunch.
Okay.
And Dawn, maybe get a hold of the Secretary of State and tell him we're gonna be about 15, 20 minutes late. And it's about 12:15. Can you be back at 1?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that work for everybody? Okay, we're in recess until 1 p.m.